their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's 12 noon and a very good afternoon. You're with GB News Live. I'm Mark Longhurst and coming up for you this Friday lunchtime. No. France says no to the King amid security fears. Protests across the country becoming more violent. The King and Queen Consort have been due to visit Bordeaux, where last night the town hall was set on fire. The official visit now postponed at the request of President Macron. We have the latest from France. If you put up your prices, we'll increase interest rates again. The warning to business from the Bank of England's Governor Andrew Bailey. But what do they think of having to swallow yet more losses in order to tackle inflation? And pull your socks up, but take your shoes off. Now, you'll be able to follow in the footsteps of the King in Westminster Abbey after the coronation, but everyone will have to tread very carefully. So let's first tiptoe over the news headlines and Rhiannon.
Very good, Mark. Good afternoon. It's 1 minute past 12. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. The first state visit of King Charles to France has been postponed because of protests across the country. Tens of thousands of people have been demonstrating against the government's plan to raise the pension age from 62 to 64. The King was due to arrive on Sunday as part of a 3-day trip to Europe. Downing Street confirmed the decision was taken with the consent of all parties after the French president asked the British government to postpone the visit. It's understood the Windsor framework has now been formally adopted by both the UK and EU. The Foreign Secretary and European Commission chaired a meeting earlier to sign off the post-Brexit trade agreement. That's after MPs voted in favour of the Stormont break, despite continued opposition from the DUP. James Cleverly told Maros Sefcovic he's grateful for his help.
This is not the corporate thanks of the British government, this is the personal thanks of me, James Cleverly, to you, Maros Sefcovic, for the commitment that you have put in, and of course the work that has been done by your wider team in getting us to what is a really good place that we are genuinely grateful.
I want to appreciate and pay respect to each and every one of you around the table, because you've been working tirelessly and in the spirit of what is possible and what we can do. While the people and businesses in Northern Ireland will now benefit from lasting certainty and predictability, the EU and UK can, and I'm convinced will, exploit the full potential of the trade and cooperation agreement.
Protesters have been demonstrating outside Downing Street, where the Israeli Prime Minister met Rishi Sunak earlier. Benjamin Netanyahu is in London as thousands rally in Israel and here against a law that's been approved by his right-wing coalition. Critics say it's designed to shield him from his corruption trial. Talks at Downing Street were expected to focus on strengthening strategic ties between the two nations, as well as focusing on Iran's nuclear programme. Ofsted says school inspections will continue. That's despite calls for them to be suspended. 3 unions representing teachers and heads want checks to be paused while a review's carried out. The Ofsted chief says stopping inspections wouldn't be in the best interests of children. It's after head teacher Ruth Perry took her own life in January while waiting for a report which downgraded her school to the lowest possible rating. Head teacher Sophie Greenaway says the mental health of staff should be a priority.
Ruth's death cannot be in vain. Ruth's death has got to lead to change. It can't just be that Ofsted say, oh, we'll have a think about the single word judgment, or that might be a good idea. That's brilliant. Yes, we would love conversations about that. That needs to happen. But that can't be the only thing. And sympathy for the family is not the only thing. They want change, and so do we.
The Shadow Health Secretary says he's concerned about the upcoming junior doctors' strike. Wes Streeting's calling on the government to resolve the pay dispute ahead of next month's industrial action. The British Medical Association, which is asking for a 35% pay rise, says no credible offer was made during talks on Wednesday. The union announced members will walk out for 4 days from April the 11th.
I'm really worried about these junior doctors' strikes, and I'm worried that unless people at that stage in their career have great specialist roles to move into once they've finished their junior doctor phase of their career, we're going to lose people to countries like Australia, to Canada, where aggressive recruitment of UK doctors is already underway. So I hope the government can resolve the junior doctors' strikes amicably.
There was a larger than expected pickup in retail sales last month, with trade returning to its pre-pandemic levels. The Office for National Statistics reported a 1.2% increase in February compared to the previous month. Experts had predicted a rise of just 0.2%. The ONS says the broader picture for retail, though, remains subdued, with little real growth over the last 18 months because of the cost of living crisis. And scientists are planning to send cancer cells to space in a bid to understand more about an incurable childhood tumour. The Institute of Cancer Research is sending samples to the International Space Station to see how it spreads in microgravity. Science Minister George Freeman says the £2.6 million project will help research brain tumour prevention in children, as well as the process of ageing. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens now, though. It's back to Mark.
Rhiannon, thank you very much indeed, or should that be merci? The first state visit of King Charles to France being postponed because of the increasingly violent protests across the country. Last night, indeed, the town hall in Bordeaux, where the King and Queen Consort are due to visit, was set on fire. Well, tens of thousands of people have been demonstrating against the French government's plan to raise the state pension age from 62 to 64. Well, King Charles was due to arrive on Sunday as part of a 3-day trip to Europe, but President Macron asking the British government to postpone that trip. Just yesterday, the French Interior Minister declaring that security posed no problem. Well, joining us in our studio now, our royal reporter Cameron Walker. And Cameron, it seems to have taken everyone a little on the hop with Macron contacting the British government, but now we have Buckingham Palace saying their Majesties greatly look forward to the opportunity to visit France as soon as dates can be found. A diplomatic reply.
Yes, indeed. I think it's pretty embarrassing for the French government, actually. As you said, it was only yesterday that they were very much insisting that this state visit was going ahead. But according to the British government, at least, it was at the request of President Macron to the British government that at least the French part of the state visit was going to be postponed. But the decision, according to a UK government spokesperson, was taken with the consent of all parties. It's understood that the King spoke on the phone with President Macron and agreed that decision.
So it wasn't just at a departmental level, there was actually a direct phone call?
No, from my understanding, it was a direct phone call between the two parties. Of course, it was meant to be a lavish state dinner as part of the Palace of Versailles. Originally, yes, but which clearly, I think, perhaps to the French government's mind wouldn't have looked great, having a Republican head of state in France, the British monarch in Versailles, having, you know, lavish foods with the red carpet, etc., as there's crowds outside chanting and
indeed, I think the
protesting.
CGT union, this Public Service Union, is saying it would not be providing help to actually get furnishings or red carpet or flags actually set up for the visit. But one wonders if it's this instance in Bordeaux where the King and Queen Consort were due to visit, they set the town hall on fire. Clearly, that would have raised the bar for security considerations.
Yeah, so there are tens of thousands of mainly peaceful protesters, but you are right, there are a few which have turned violent, very violent, if you look at the pictures of the burning buildings, etc. And I think security would have been a factor in this. As we know, the King and Queen Consorts are very keen to meet as many ordinary members of the public as possible. I think perhaps we could have predicted that they would, although it's not been confirmed, but we could predict that they would be doing a few walkabouts where they go and shake hands of members of the public.
Which the King's been very keen to actually stress, to meeting people.
He has been. Ever since he came to the throne, he was doing that, even despite the threat of eggs being hurled at him on a couple of occasions in Great Britain. He is still defiant and wanted to do the same thing. And I'm sure we would have seen it in Paris itself. But clearly, I think this is going to be a bit of a blow for the King, because this was his first foreign trip as the head of state, along with the Queen Consort. And clearly, it was meant to be a strengthening of ties between France and the United Kingdom. But clearly, it's a pretty difficult situation.
And of course, it follows this rapprochement when we saw Rishi Sunak and President Macron at the Elysee Palace. A bromance, as some of the newspapers described it, and clearly an effort to get relationships on a warmer footing. And we do actually reflect then, of course, of President Macron coming to Westminster Abbey at the time of the Queen's funeral, and his words said then, which were taken very much to heart by Buckingham Palace.
They certainly were, and I think we have seen Prince William in Warsaw yesterday with the President of Poland, and confirming that he was going to be attending King Charles III's coronation. I don't think perhaps it would surprise me if an invitation was extended personally, perhaps from King Charles to President Macron. We don't know, of course, but that would perhaps see fitting that perhaps the French president would come across for the coronation. Because
well, especially if there's a personal phone call between the two. One wonders, exactly what was... Not that we should speculate, but matters were discussed.
Not of course. Yes, of course. But from our understanding, the German part of the state visit, of course, the King and Queen Consorts were visiting two countries.
And this was on Monday?
Still going ahead.
Right, OK.
So the King was meant to arrive in Paris on Sunday. He was going to be there until Wednesday, visiting Paris and Bordeaux, where we've seen those protests. And then he would be travelling on to Germany, to a couple of cities there. So that is still going ahead, according to the British government, and from my understanding from speaking to sources inside Buckingham Palace, and the King and Queen Consorts very much are looking forward to rearranging their trip to France as soon as new dates are sorted. We are expecting new dates of this of the French state's visit very soon. Actually, they haven't put a time on it, but I can't imagine it's going to be much longer than a week.
But one wonders about the amount of work that has to go on behind the scenes to get these things rejigged, given all the considerations, not just the security, but of the diaries that are full both sides of the channel.
Absolutely. State visits take months to plan, and it's in consultation with Buckingham Palace, yes, but the Foreign Office and, of course, the foreign government in question as well. And all the logistics that goes with the state's visit, having very high-profile VIPs with the security concerns, the logistical diaries, as you were saying there. So a lot of work, essentially, has gone down, the kitchen sink. However, perhaps they are hoping that they can reschedule for a later date. But no doubt it will be disappointing for the King and Queen Consorts, but they very much perhaps will be looking forward to Germany.
Right. Cameron, thank you for taking us through all that. Let's get some reaction now with Grant Harrell joining us, former butler, of course, to, as he was then, Prince Charles, now King Charles, of course. Grant, thanks for joining us once more. Just to reiterate the official word from Buckingham Palace, Their Majesties greatly look forward to the opportunity to visit France as soon as dates can be found. But I wonder if he's going to be spitting tax at this.
Good afternoon, Mark. He'll be really disappointed, because one thing about him is when he says he's going to do something, he likes to do it. He will not like the fact that this is having to be postponed. I think it'll be something that will upset him and really frustrate him. I mean, obviously, as Cameron was saying, the Berlin visit will still carry on. I think it's next Wednesday. So the trip will still continue, but obviously missing out France. But you see, I think this is obviously important for him because France has always been a close ally. Even his late mother, I mean, 5 years into her reign, she had a state visit to France. So it shows you the fact he's planned this so soon into him being king is obviously something that's important to him. So as I mentioned, he will not like the fact that this has been postponed. If anything, it really will frustrate him and upset him that this has happened.
Yes, and we remember, of course, the Queen, a fluent French speaker, and then we remember President Macron coming to the funeral. Interesting, actually, the camera was reflecting. We understand there was a direct phone call between King Charles and President Macron. Now, I wonder, that doesn't seem to be that common an occurrence for a head of state, effectively, to have a direct phone call.
No, I mean, obviously this is what he would do, because the fact that he's having to cancel, he will take this really personal, even though there's obviously reasons. I mean, again, as Cameron said, the security part is really important. I remember even when, as Prince of Wales, it was always something that came first, even though that would also, he would find that quite frustrating, because I think he feels he's there to do a job, and sometimes this restricts him doing that job. So taking that phone call, having that phone call was his way of saying to the French president that he is deeply upset the fact that he can't make this visit at this moment in time.
And give us a clue as to what will be happening now behind the scenes in the royal household, because presumably things will have been packed in preparation and arrangements made and all sorts of things now having to be rejigged and cancelled.
This is the problem. The diary's planned so many months in advance, Mark. I mean, I remember that well. These things are planned 6 months, if not more, in advance. So this will obviously be a bit of a disaster, if I can say that, because obviously now, as you've mentioned, things have got to be replanned, reorganised, things have got to be moved, and even right down, as you mentioned, even the dress codes, depending on what he's attending. But I think the fact that he's still carrying on doing the first part of the tour to Berlin, it won't have a huge impact, but it will be an impact, and there'll be a lot right now. There will be a lot of kind of phone calls and a lot of reorganisation going on at this moment in time to get things back on track for the second part of the visit, which will now be the first part.
And of course, there's been much discussion about the new king, as he's still described, and his approach to politics. Of course, this is very important, what they call soft power. Even though it's not a state political visit as such, it's clearly a rapprochement across the Channel.
You're quite right. I mean, as we know, that with our monarchy, constitutional monarchy, they technically don't, they take the advice from the government. And obviously, these visits are asked, the government asks the king on their behalf to do these visits. So obviously, they've got to be slightly careful of this thing, which is why it's interesting he had that phone call. It's not unusual, but it just again shows you that, he's very aware that as a king, he's got to take a slight back step, like his late mother did. But at the same time, he is passionate. He does care about things going on in the world, and I've always said I think he will continue to do that and to show that. But as I said, he's just got to be slightly careful, because when it comes to his role as king, he's got to be, as we know, non-political. He's got to kind of keep away from that. He's there to advise and to listen, but not really to get involved, which again is with these protests. He doesn't really want to be out there when all that's going on, because that'd be kind of getting him involved in it just by being there.
Yes, yeah, and therefore that becomes quite difficult, especially with the unions directly referring to the trip. But Grant, thank you very much indeed for joining us with your reaction to this, and of course we'll see when the visit is rejigged. Thank you very much. Now let's reflect on some more demonstrations that have been taking place, this time in London, after the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met Rishi Sunak at 10 Downing Street, with noisy demonstrations by Israelis along Whitehall. The meeting designed to strengthen bilateral ties, especially in defence and intelligence. But of course, in Israel itself, Netanyahu facing growing opposition to what's being interpreted as an increasingly autocratic approach at removing checks and balances within the Israeli state. The visit sparking protests outside Downing Street. Our national reporter Paul Hawkins has been following events there for us. And Paul, of course, we've also had in the past the demonstrations with Palestinian demonstrators, concerns about the two-state solution. This is a different take now. This is actually Israelis themselves demonstrating against Netanyahu and his approach.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So earlier we had two huge demonstrations from Israeli demonstrators here and then Palestinian demonstrators over there. Obviously, we know why they're all often Palestinian demonstrations during the visit of an Israeli Prime Minister, but there were also Israeli demonstrations as well because of what Benjamin Netanyahu, the way he wants to change the legal system in Israel, also demonstration about women's rights. But let's speak to the protesters themselves. We're joined by Jonathan, who's with us. And Jonathan, you're here to welcome Benjamin Netanyahu to the UK, and Gilly as well. Thanks for joining us as well in the rain, both of you. And Gilly, you're here as well. Why are you here? What's your message for Benjamin Netanyahu? It's very different from Jonathan's.
The message is that the current government in Israel is dangerous. It's dangerous especially for women with the changes that are currently going on. Just to say, from the beginning of 2023, 7 women were murdered by their husbands in Israel. And what this government did is to vote against a restraint law that will help women to protect themselves.
Right, and that's why you had some of the demonstrators marching around wearing Handmaid's Tale outfits earlier, and also concerns about the judiciary, the changes to the judiciary that he wants to make, giving the government more control over the selection of judges and paring back the power of the Supreme Court. Yeah,
this government basically works days and nights to make sure that women will not hold any powerful positions. They're just erasing women from public spaces, and we're very concerned about that. And that's
and just very quickly, what would you like Rishi Sunak to say to Benjamin Netanyahu?
To keep Israel safe and democratic.
Right, okay. And Jonathan, why did you feel you had to be here with this counter-demonstration?
We normally would not comment on Israeli domestic politics, but we knew that there were going to be a lot of people here against the Prime Minister, and we think that he is the elected democratic Prime Minister of Israel. The judicial reforms, they don't obstruct democracy, they are pro-democracy, because the situation in Israel is that non-elected judges can make the law. It's unlike the United States, unlike UK, and all that the judicial reform wants to do is to restore the balance. Now, as far as women are concerned, women in Israel are the most free in anywhere in the Middle East. There are women in the army, there are women in senior positions everywhere in Israel.
So this is going to be changed soon.
Sorry.
This is going to be changed soon.
No.
That's what this government...
No. There are a lot of myths about this government, unfortunately. I've heard the most ridiculous myths about this government's programme. The government's programme is on the Knesset website. You can read it for yourself. There is nothing about discrimination against women in the government's programme. A lot of the people who are here today, they failed to win the election under Lapid and Gantz, and so they're here trying to refight the election on different grounds.
I can just see Jenny wants to come in.
I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts regarding the MP Avi Maoz says about that women are only good for raising children and having babies? I didn't say that. It's your MP that said that.
There are people who talk in the Knesset. There are some absurd proposals that come out from individual people in the Knesset.
It's not an individual, it's an MP.
No, there is no programme of the government against women. MPs in this country say absurd things, but it never sees the light of day in terms of legislation. And it's the same in Israel. You see all sorts of crazy proposals coming out from individual members of the Knesset, but these proposals never see the light of day.
They just voted against the restraint law, so I don't know. You can call them individuals, but at the moment, the legislation that's currently in Israel is really against women.
And just very quickly, on the issue of picking judges, that the government has more control over which judges are on the courts, and that the Supreme Court won't have the power, if these reforms go through, to strike down legislation.
In the United States and the United Kingdom, the Supreme Court cannot strike down legislation, and all that's happening in Israel is to echo that. At the moment, the Supreme Court can do anything. It can even strike out prime ministers, and we need to restore the balance. This is not the only government that's wanted to restore the balance. Many previous governments have wanted to restore the balance. And there's a video of Lapid I saw saying that we need to restore the balance between unelected judges and elected politicians. Elected politicians should make the law. It's not up to unelected judges to make the law.
OK, thanks for speaking to us, Jen. Thanks for speaking to us, Julie. Thank you very much. Yep.
So
that's kind of how things are panning out here. We know that the demonstration is going to move on to the Savoy. That's where Benjamin Netanyahu is staying at the moment. And Liberal Democrat MPs, they've written to the Prime Minister, also Alicia Kearns, the Conservative chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, questioning the wisdom of this visit by Benjamin Netanyahu and pressure being applied to Rishi Sunak to talk to Benjamin Netanyahu about the reforms that he wants to introduce in Israel. But yeah, as you've seen here, there is a counter demonstration here from people that are welcoming Benjamin Netanyahu to the UK, but also lots and lots of people here who are unhappy about his visit, and they want Rishi Sunak to politely have a word with him.
Yeah, Paul, fascinating just to get the discourse there, and of course the opposing points of view and the dynamic there in London, of course, on that state visit. Thank you very much indeed for updating us there. So that's the picture in London. Let's now cross to Tel Aviv and speak to Yotam Confino, foreign editor of Jewish News. Yotam, I don't know if you managed to hear what was being said there in London, indicative, of course, of how this has split Israeli society, and some seeing Netanyahu as this increasingly authoritarian figure.
I did indeed hear it, and I have to just open with saying that you're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And I'm afraid that one of the counter-protests was simply stating something that is false, absolutely false. What this judicial overhaul aims to do, according to them, according to the government, is to restore the checks and balances. But if you look at what is actually happening here, if you look at the plan, it will not restore the checks and balances. In fact, it will give the government power to legislate however it wants, to pass any law it wants, without a Supreme Court holding it accountable. And because Israel doesn't have a constitution which protects human rights and civil rights, that simply means that there will be no protection of the civil rights. The government will be the protector of the civil rights. But when you have a government that has really extreme lawmakers, fundamentalists and very religious people who wish to change Israel's very nature, then yes, there is a reason to be afraid that they will take it very far. So just wanted to explain that, because it's simply...
Yeah. Just to explain to people, of course, it is acknowledged as being a right-wing coalition now that Netanyahu is at the helm of. But I gather there is specific concern, too, that the legislation would effectively protect anyone, including Netanyahu, from being removed, from being unfit to rule. So it's being seen maybe as rubber stamping some kind of change to the democratic process.
Exactly. There are so many elements to the judicial reforms that are, let's say, critical, in the sense that you can really pick them out and you can pick them apart, really. Let's start with Netanyahu and the fact that he's on trial for corruption. They passed a law in Parliament on Wednesday, which basically will make it impossible for the Attorney General to declare a sitting Prime Minister unfit for office. And this is just one step towards making sure that nobody can touch Netanyahu. Yesterday, in a speech on live TV, Netanyahu said that he will no longer obey the order from the Attorney General, which prohibits him from intervening and interfering directly with the judicial reforms, which is illegal, according to the Attorney General. This is just one aspect of the reforms. There's the whole issue of Netanyahu and his trial, and how the reforms might eventually exonerate him from his trial.
OK, Yotam, I'm just going to update you and everyone else. We're just learning about what's happened inside Number 10. Apparently, Rishi Sunak spoke to Mr Netanyahu about, quote, the importance of upholding the democratic values that underpin our relationship. That's been released by Downing Street, which is quite a pointed comment. But we reflect, of course, that what was the driving force for this was to talk about defence and international politics, and of course the fear about what Iran might do in the Middle East, and therefore Israel really wanting the Western powers to actually acknowledge that.
That is true. Obviously, Netanyahu is a statesman. He needs to visit other countries. He needs to visit his allies, which he's doing. He met with Macron in Paris. He went to Berlin to meet with Scholz. He went to Rome, and now he's in England. But pretty much all of them, besides the Italian Prime Minister, have somehow pointed out that what's happening in Israel is concerning, and that we hear Sunak now also pointing this out without a press conference. It also says a lot of things about the nature of the relationship. But yes, you are right. Iran is definitely a concern for both countries. Iran's nuclear program is advancing rapidly, and it's not just a threat to Israel. It's a threat to all of the Western allies, the ones that Iran is hostile towards. So it is a concern for Sunak. And of course, they need to talk about this. And I'm sure that they'll be talking much more in depth about certain actions that they can take, because time is really running out when it comes to Iran's nuclear program.
OK, Yotam Konfina, foreign editor of Jewish News in Tel Aviv. Thank you very much for joining us and updating us with a view from there. Thanks very much. And, of course, we'll update you on the visit to Number 10 and what is released about the talks going on at the moment. Also coming up, Ofsted. They say that stopping or preventing school inspections not in the children's best interest. But we'll be seeing what the head teachers think of all that. And also the latest GB News People's Poll, seeing what you think about everything and a few more things besides. We'll be back after this short break.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit off.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway,
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We've got a brand new lineup every Saturday night on GB News.
from 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight. Brand new Saturday nights on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. It's 12:32. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. The first state visit of King Charles to France has been postponed because of protests across the country. Tens of thousands of people have been demonstrating against the government's plan to raise the pension age from 62 to 64. The King was due to arrive on Sunday as part of a 3-day trip to Europe. Buckingham Palace says the royal couple is looking forward to visiting France as soon as new dates are found. It's understood the Windsor framework has now been formally adopted by both the UK and EU. The Foreign Secretary and European Commission chaired a meeting earlier to sign off the post-Brexit trade agreement. It's after MPs voted in favour of the Stormont break, despite continued opposition from the DUP. Protesters have been demonstrating outside Downing Street, where Israeli Prime Minister met Rishi Sunak earlier. Benjamin Netanyahu is in London as thousands rally in Israel and here against a law that's been approved by his right-wing coalition. Critics say it's designed to shield him from his corruption trial. Number 10 says Rishi Sunak has stressed the importance of upholding democratic values and has called for de-escalation in the West Bank. And Ofsted says school inspections will continue despite calls for them to be suspended. Unions representing teachers and heads want checks to be paused while a review's carried out. It's after head teacher Ruth Perry took her own life in January while waiting for a report which downgraded her school to the lowest possible rating. TV online, DAB+ radio and TuneIn. This is GB News. Now it's back over to Mark.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, let's tell you that 1 in 4 pregnancies end in loss. Today, Parliament expecting to hear the second reading of the Paid Miscarriage Leave Bill. Now, it's a bill introduced by the SNP's MP, Angela Crawley. It seeks to grant 3 days of statutory paid leave to those parents who experience a miscarriage before 24 weeks of pregnancy. Well, currently, paid bereavement leave only provided after stillbirth following 24 weeks or 6 months into the pregnancy. Our national reporter Ellie Costello has this report.
George Langthorne was born sleeping at 22 weeks.
George was a baby. He only weighed a pound when he was born, but he had blonde hair, big feet. Like me. He was a fully formed baby. We got to dress him and bathe him and photograph him and cuddle him. And yeah, but for anyone going through an experience of birth, it's terrifying anyway, especially the first time. But to know that you're going through a birth and that your baby's not going to survive is horrendous.
Because George was born at 24 weeks, Keely was not entitled to paid miscarriage leave. Luckily, the law firm she works for allowed her 6 weeks off to grieve. But Keely was aware that other parents were not in the same fortunate position.
The law says you go back to work at 9 o'clock the next day. So, for instance, I left George at the mortuary on a Thursday night, and the law says that I go back to work at 9 o'clock the next day. There's no way I could have done that. I just physically had a baby. Mentally, I was grieving the loss of my son. I don't know how anyone in their right mind would think that it's okay to say to someone, go back to work the next day, you'll be all right. Or take it as sick leave. But this isn't sick leave. It isn't sick leave, it is an annual leave.
Keely is now campaigning for a change in the law, which would give a statutory 3 days of paid miscarriage leave for a loss at any time in the pregnancy. She's calling it George's Law.
We are now in 2023 where all we talk about is well-being and equality and diversity. But I don't see how any firm can say that they promote equality and diversity if they haven't got a baby loss policy in place.
1 in 4 pregnancies end in miscarriage. Under current legislation, workers are entitled to 2 weeks of paid bereavement leave following a stillbirth after 24 weeks of pregnancy. But for parents who experience a loss after less than 24 weeks, they must rely on either unpaid or sick leave if they feel unable to return to work after a loss. Ruth Bender-Attic is the director of the Miscarriage Association.
Yes, we do support the bill, and we support it strongly, and we've been talking with Angela Crawley about it for quite some time. First of all, they'd have at least a little bit of time to begin to recover from the kind of physical and emotional impact of miscarriage or ectopic pregnancy. It would really go a long way in recognising and acknowledging even these tiniest of lives, which for most people, the minute they have a positive pregnancy test, they're already thinking and planning and dreaming about.
We asked the government to respond to this call for George's Law, but nobody was available for interview. They gave us this statement. Miscarriage is a very personal experience, and some of those affected may want to stay at home, while others may prefer to continue to work or alternatively may need time off later. The government believes that individuals are best placed to understand their own specific needs, and good employers will respond to requests made by their employees in a sensitive way. Keeley says she will still continue to fight for George's law. Ellie Costello, GB News.
And of course, we'll keep you updated on that very sensitive issue here on GB News. Now, our latest GB News People's Poll is out. We asked the public to give their verdicts on a certain Boris Johnson and the Met Police, of course, after a controversial week last week regarding the former Prime Minister. We can tell you 48% of you thought that the investigation into his alleged misleading of Parliament was fair. Only 11% thought the inquiry unfair. The poll also showing that 45% of the public had a negative view of the Met Police after, of course, Baroness Casey's damning report, just 10% having a positive view. And in the latest voting intentions for Westminster, the general election, Labour down 2%, Conservatives up 2%. However, the gap's still pretty substantial at 21% points. Our political reporter and voice of the people now, Olivia Utley, joining us in the studio. It's interesting that, of course, the public's perception differs slightly to the politicians in the Westminster bubble, but our findings tying in with another poll, Survation, where they found 2/3 of people did not believe his defence of the Partygate votes situation.
Yes, overall, the two polls taken together are pretty bad news for Boris Johnson. He was hoping to land this kangaroo court line, essentially to imply that the whole committee was skewed against him.
And had made their minds up already.
And had made their minds up beforehand. That hasn't worked with the public. The public thinks that the investigation is fair. They think that it is justified. So it'll be interesting to see what the committee comes back with. But either way, Boris Johnson is going to have a very tough time trying to imply to the general public that the findings were unfair. So it looks like he's going to have to accept the result of this investigation, and he has been threatening in an implicit way that he wouldn't be accepting that result. But if the public accepts it, he'll have to. Yeah,
and have we got any indication what people think the sanction should be? Because, I mean, as we've been explaining, if they go the full way, the 10-day suspension, that effectively is him out of Parliament and his political career over.
Yeah, well, it's hard to know exactly what the public think about the length of the suspension. I think because it's such a complicated process and technical processes, it's hard to understand. But it seems as though, you know, there are people who I've spoken to, lots of Conservative voters who feel, and this is backed up by a poll that was in Conservative Home a couple of days ago, who the majority among them appears to be that they feel that Boris Johnson should keep his seat but shouldn't return to frontline politics, which in my mind is probably the likeliest outcome of this investigation, that he gets a suspension for recklessly misleading Parliament. But I think the committee may feel that they're unable to prove definitively that he deliberately misled Parliament, and so may feel that they're unable to give him the suspension of 10 days, which would result in the recall election, which would result in the by-election.
Yeah, so he's going to be left rumbling on the back benches, which one imagines is not going to be that comfortable for him.
Not very comfortable for him. Not very comfortable for Rishi Sunak either, because although Boris Johnson doesn't hold the sort of sway among the backbench of the Conservative Party as he once did, and we saw with that Windsor framework vote the other day that he was unable to bring a huge swathe of MPs with him, he is still a personality in the Conservative Party. And although the government is right to keep pushing forward the fact that only 22 MPs rebelled against the Windsor framework, it should be noted that 48 MPs abstained from voting at all. So that rump of Brexiteers isn't a spent force entirely. And we know that Boris Johnson is a charismatic politician. He's quite good with people. And while he is on the back benches, there is always the possibility, however faint,
the whiff of gun smoke.
Exactly.
And we've been trying to assess what damage this has done to the Conservative Party and, of course, the Casey report as well, Baroness Casey's report on the Met Police. In terms of the overall positioning of the party, or parties rather, Labour down, Conservatives up to, although obviously still a substantial gap between the two.
Yeah, to be honest, looking at this poll, I'd be pretty chuffed if I was Rishi Sunak. I mean, of course, the absolute figures aren't great. There's still a 21-point gap between the Labour and the Conservatives. But the gap between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer on who would make the best Prime Minister is very small. It's only a 6-point gap, which, given Labour's huge lead in the national polls, isn't great for Starmer.
I'm just being told that the Windsor framework has just been officially signed off, which, of course, is going to be a feather in Rishi Sunak's cap. And certainly a lot of Tories have been reflecting that this is a Prime Minister who, I think Liam Fox used the phrase, under-promises but over-delivers, which is an interesting phrase.
It's a phrase that Rishi Sunak keeps using himself as well. And I think that's really interesting. I mean, we knew that the Windsor framework was going to pass, but I think these three questions taken together, 27% of the public, only 23% of the public believe there's a big difference between Labour and the Conservatives in terms of what they're offering.
Really?
And Rishi Sunak is really very hot on the heels of Keir Starmer in the polls.
Yeah.
So it would be a bit of a worry for Labour. Starmer doesn't clearly have, according to the polls, the sort of personality to drive through a Labour victory on his own. And it doesn't seem as though the public see much of a difference between
because
in terms of what they're offering.
We know Private Eye has got this sort of image of him as Max Headroom, for those of you who remember sort of Channel 4 in the early days. But this is an interesting sort of point about the centre ground of politics, where Labour perhaps wants to move, perhaps Rishi Sunak wants to move as well, but clearly not enough room for both parties there.
Well, exactly, and I think when we had a Liz Truss government, when we had a Boris Johnson government, Keir Starmer's offering was that he was the competent, sensible, grown-up in the room. Well, Rishi Sunak fills that space.
That managerial sort of role.
That managerial sort of technocratic, great with people like Macron, who are from the same sort of world as him, able to get this sort of important diplomacy over the line. The Windsor framework is huge in our ongoing relations with the EU. So if Keir Starmer was sort of hoping to differentiate himself as the grown-up politician, well, he's going to have to do a bit more thinking. And I went to his launch speech of his 5 goals for the country a few months ago, and it was really interesting how little ideology was in there. It was all about Labour being competent. Well, Sunak showing himself to be competent.
Yeah, although still a question about the boats. Can they stop the boats, which was his main thrust in terms of that. But thank you very much indeed for bringing us those results, and we'll reflect on them, as we will, coming up on that breaking news that the Windsor framework has been signed. Has it been sealed? Yes. Can it be delivered? Well, that's the big question, of course, in terms of the reaction. We'll update you on that in a moment.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you
All
know, Kate
sorts
Moss?
of rooms. Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island's story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Now, let's just update you what we were talking to Olivia about in terms of the Windsor framework, the formal sign-off, of course, of this deal as regards the Stormont break and all the other issues about Northern Ireland and the border. We are being told that it has now been formally signed. Press Association saying that it's understood to have happened mid-morning at the very snappily entitled Withdrawal Agreement Joint Committee. So they've not made much of a song and dance about it, but the ink now apparently dry on that. Northern Ireland Secretary Chris Heaton-Harris again warning the DUP no prospect of now renegotiating the deal after Brussels, of course, formally agreed to the key parts at a Council of the EU meeting. So it has been signed and is effectively, I guess, now in acting abeyance. But Maros Sefcovic, the European Commission chair, with James Cleverly, formally adopting the arrangements and an indication that the Partnership Council will go ahead with the implementation. James Cleverly saying, by formally approving the Windsor framework, we're delivering on our commitment to provide stability and certainty for Northern Ireland. The framework, the best deal for Northern Ireland to safeguard its place in the Union and to protect the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. I look forward to further effective cooperation with the EU on key issues such as security and energy. So that's just coming in. And let's get now more with Catherine in terms of the reaction to this. They sort of snuck it under the doorstep a little bit without the razzmatazz one normally gets with these things being signed.
Yes, after all the hullabaloo at Windsor a few weeks ago, the Dear Rishi from Ursula von der Leyen, then the vote on the Stormont break on Wednesday, finally Rishi Sunak's answer to the Northern Ireland protocol that has caused so many problems. The Windsor framework has just been signed in the last few minutes in London by James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, and the European Commission Vice President Maros Sefcovic. Now, Maros Sefcovic used to be referred to as the Beast of Brussels. He used to take one of the hardest of hard lines from the EU, but times have certainly changed. The feeling, the mood is much more positive, much more emollient between both sides, and the hope is now that they can move forward and that they can begin working on other areas of potential cooperation, specifically the EU's Science and Technology Research Horizon programme that the UK would dearly love to be involved with. So I think this will certainly be chalked up as a win for Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Of course, not everybody is happy. There were 22 Conservative MPs, including former Prime Minister Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, who voted against it, among others. Some of the ERG that used to be so influential in decision-making here in Westminster, and of course the whole of the Democratic Unionist Party, who would have liked the government to go back and reopen negotiations with the European Union, but that is not happening. So in terms of Stormont power sharing, it doesn't look like that will be coming back anytime soon, because the DUP are not satisfied with this agreement. But the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement is looming in April. It looks like President Biden may be coming over to market with or without power sharing. And I think, as the Deputy ERG Chairman David Jones said of Brexit, the problem is people are tired of it, frankly, almost physically tired of it. Everybody wants the whole thing to go away. And for many people, they will be hoping that Brexit is finally done, though, of course, a few dissenting voices, to put it mildly.
Yeah, as you indicate, obviously, we had the situation where the White House was pressing for this to get done and dusted before that 25th anniversary of Good Friday. But clearly, we've still got no formal power sharing at Stormont. It's still not sitting effectively. And the DUP left sort of hanging in the air. James Cleverly again saying no prospect of renegotiating this deal. Where does this leave the DUP and Jeffrey Donaldson?
In a very difficult position, frankly, because there's been no power sharing now in Northern Ireland, no government there, if you like, at Stormont for over a year, since the DUP collapsed it over their concerns with the Northern Irish Protocol. Now, although Jeffrey Donaldson has admitted that this is much better and substantial progress has been made, there are, of course, these concerns about the Stormont break that, in theory, allows Northern Ireland to overrule or block new EU laws coming in. Now, they're saying it's going to be very difficult to do that, but of course, that Stormont break can only be applied if Stormont is sitting, and at the moment Stormont is not sitting, and there is no prospect of that happening. So where we go from here in terms of government in Northern Ireland, really, who knows? But another factor might be, of course, that Sinn Féin now are the largest party in Northern Ireland, and that's going to be difficult for the Democratic Unionist Party if and when they do go back into power sharing, and that they will be potentially the junior partner.
With Olivia as well, the GB News poll and what people think about the situation. Of course, we've got the ERG, as you're saying, licking its wounds perhaps after this as well, because that rebellion that Boris Johnson was hoping for over this whole issue did not actually come to pass. Obviously, the DUP MPs voting against it, but only, 22 Conservatives, as perhaps some may describe the usual suspects, voting against it.
Yes, I think somebody said the usual suspects and the awkward squad. Only 22 Conservative MPs actively voted against it, though 48 did abstain. So although, yes, that's quite a lot, 70 in total, that for whatever reason either opposed it or didn't actively vote for it, Rishi Sunak will be happy that he did get it through. I think the vote was 515 to 29. Yeah. So that's really quite definitive, isn't it? And he will be happy. And certainly the European Research Group is not as powerful as it once was. And even, indeed, dare we suggest, Boris Johnson and Liz Truss and Ian Duncan Smith, another former Conservative leader that led this rebellion, might have hoped for it to take off far beyond the numbers that they ultimately got.
7 days is a long time in politics, as they say. Thank you very much indeed, Catherine, for that. Let's now actually take you to Brussels, because President Macron is speaking. Of course, President Macron having met Rishi Sunak ahead of this Windsor framework with that meeting in the Élysée Palace. But in particular, of course, we've got the news this morning about the visit from King Charles and the Queen Consort to France being postponed. We now know that President Macron spoke to King Charles on the phone this morning, following discussions between the UK and French governments. That postponed a major embarrassment, of course, to the French leader and his administration, and, of course, to Buckingham Palace as well, because this state visit, as it is, had been planned for months. Buckingham Palace saying Their Majesties greatly look forward to the opportunity to visit France as soon as dates can be found. But in terms of President Macron, he is now facing this widespread process across the country. In particular, in Bordeaux, they tried to burn down the town hall last night, where, of course, King Charles and the Queen Consort Camilla were due to visit. So clearly that's what's reassessed the security situation. But Macron, we're told, to press ahead with this decision to extend the age of the state pension from 62 to 64. And he's in his second term, so he's saying he doesn't need to consider a situation about being re-elected. He wants this reform to go ahead to help the French economy. So clearly he's got a big workload ahead of him. But speaking in Brussels at the moment, we'll reflect on what he's saying on that a little later. I think now we can actually look ahead to the next hour, because we'll be looking at what the Bank of England governor has said to businesses. Don't put up your prices or we'll put up interest rates again. What do they think of that? We'll be finding out in a moment.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the people's channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Very good afternoon and welcome to GB News Live with me, Mark Longhurst, and coming up for you this Friday lunchtime. King King Charles has his visit to France postponed because of the security fears and protests across the country becoming ever more violent. The King and Queen Consort have been due to visit Bordeaux, but last night they tried to burn down the town hall. The official visit now postponed at the request of President Macron, and he's been speaking in Brussels. We'll have the latest for you on that. Pull your socks up, but take your shoes off. How you'll be able to follow in the footsteps of the King in Westminster Abbey after the coronation. But everyone will have to tread very carefully because of this. And the battle for Bakhmut still going on in Ukraine. It's now reported 1,000 Russians have been killed in the past 24 hours alone as Ukraine begins a counter-offensive. We'll have the latest live from Ukraine. But first, let's get an update on all the headlines with Rhiannon.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon. It's 2 minutes past 1. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. The first state visit of King Charles to France has been postponed because of protests across the country. Tens of thousands of people have been demonstrating against the government's plan to raise the pension age from 62 to 64. The King was due to arrive on Sunday as part of a 3-day trip to Europe. Downing Street confirmed the decision was taken with the consent of all parties after the French president asked the British government to postpone the visit. It's understood the Windsor framework has now been formally adopted by both the UK and EU. The Foreign Secretary and European Commission chaired a meeting earlier to sign off the post-Brexit trade agreement. That's after MPs voted in favour of the Stormont break, despite continued opposition from the DUP. James Cleverly told Maros Sefcovic he's grateful for his help.
This is not the corporate thanks of the British government, this is the personal thanks of me, James Cleverly, to you, Maros Sefcovic, for the commitment that you have put in, and of course the work that has been done by your wider team in getting us to what is a really good place that we are genuinely grateful.
I want to appreciate and pay respect to each and every one of you around the table, because you've been working tirelessly and in the spirit of what is possible and what we can do. While the people and businesses in Northern Ireland will now benefit from lasting certainty and predictability, the EU and UK can, and I'm convinced will, exploit the full potential of the trade and cooperation agreement.
The Prime Minister has stressed the importance of upholding democratic values at a meeting with his Israeli counterpart. Benjamin Netanyahu is in London as thousands rally in Israel and here against a law that's been approved by his right-wing coalition. Critics say it's designed to shield him from his corruption trial. Rishi Sunak also called for a de-escalation in the West Bank. Ofsted says school inspections will continue despite calls from teaching unions for them to be suspended. 3 unions say they should be paused while a review is carried out. It's after head teacher Ruth Perry took her own life in January. She was awaiting a school report, but the Ofsted chief says that wouldn't be in the best interests of children. Head teacher Sophie Greenaway says the mental health of staff should be a priority.
Ruth's death cannot be in vain. Ruth's death has got to lead to change. It can't just be that Ofsted say, oh, we'll have a think about the single word judgment, or that might be a good idea. That's brilliant. Yes, we would love conversations about that. That needs to happen. But that can't be the only thing. And sympathy for the family is not the only thing. They want change, and so do we.
The Shadow Health Secretary says he's concerned about the upcoming junior doctors' strike. The British Medical Association announced members will walk out for 4 days from the 11th of April. The union's demanding a 35% pay rise. Wes Streeting's calling on the government to resolve the pay dispute before the industrial action takes place.
I'm really worried about these junior doctors' strikes, and I'm worried that unless people at that stage in their career have great specialist roles to move into once they've finished their junior doctor phase of their career, we're going to lose people to countries like Australia, to Canada, where aggressive recruitment of UK doctors is already underway. So I hope the government can resolve the junior doctors' strikes amicably.
There was a larger than expected pickup in retail sales last month, with trade returning to its pre-pandemic levels. The Office for National Statistics reported a 1.2% increase in February compared to the previous month. Experts had predicted a rise of just 0.2%. The ONS says the broader picture, though, for retail remains subdued, with little real growth over the last 18 months because of the cost of living crisis. And scientists are planning to send cancer cells to space in a bid to understand more about an incurable childhood tumour. The Institute of Cancer Research is sending samples to the International Space Station to see how it spreads in microgravity. Science Minister George Freeman says the £2.6 million project will help research brain tumour prevention in children, as well as the process of ageing. This is GB News. We're bringing more as it happens. Now, back to Mark.
Rhiannon, thank you very much indeed. So, that first state visit of King Charles to France postponed because of the increasingly violent protests across the country. Indeed, last night in Bordeaux, the town hall where the King and Queen consort were due to visit was set on fire. Tens of thousands of people demonstrating across the country in protest at the French government's plan to raise the state pension age from 62 to 64. Now, the King was due to arrive on Sunday as part of a 3-day trip to Europe, but we're told President Macron asked the British government to postpone the trip, and then a phone call was made between the President and the King. Just yesterday, the French Interior Minister had declared that security posed no problem. So, what's changed? Well, our royal reporter Cameron Walker joins us now in the studio. Clearly, it's a little local difficulty if they burn the town hall down in the town where the King's due to visit.
Yes, indeed. I think it's pretty embarrassing for the French government that they've had to U-turn in the last 24 hours. Security experts seem to be suggesting that this would have been on advice from both the French police and the French security services in terms of cancelling the French visit because it would be too dangerous with the number of violent protests we have seen. But also, I think there's perhaps political motivation behind this. I think the optics of having the French president and the King of the United Kingdom in the Palace of Versailles enjoying a state banquet as
Marie
as the
Antoinette
town,
moment.
exactly, as Paris is quite literally burning, and it would be a Marie Antoinette moment, which wouldn't have gone down too well.
Well, we've got President Macron speaking at the moment in Brussels, and he has touched on this. We understand that he said, we've suggested to plan a new visit at the start of the summer. And, of course, you were telling us that there was actually this direct phone call between Macron and the King earlier today.
Yes, the spokesperson for the British government, no, not British government, sorry, French government,
Elysée Palace,
has confirmed that there was a phone call that took place this morning between the King and Emmanuel Macron, where it was decided by all parties that it would be best to postpone this part of the state visit to Paris. As you just said, Mark, Emmanuel Macron, French president, has been speaking in the last few minutes where he has suggested that the French part of the state visit should be rescheduled to the start of the summer. Clearly, there's very busy diaries going on in terms of the King, the Queen consorts, and, of course, President Macron himself. But the summer tends to be a bit of a lull period for members of the royal family, so perhaps that was the thinking behind it.
OK.
Whether or not that's reciprocated across the other side of the channel, we don't know, but clearly this seems like a convenient time. Nothing from Buckingham Palace yet in terms of any confirmation of new dates, but we do understand that the Berlin part, the Germany part of the state visit is going ahead as planned, and that would start on Wednesday.
But we reflect, of course, that Macron will be there for the coronation in May, and we remember him coming over to pay his own personal tribute at the funeral of Queen Elizabeth. I mean, there is obviously that entente cordiale, and we reflect, of course, you know, the Queen had very close relations, a fluent French speaker.
Yes, he did, and I think it was Grant Harold, the former butler, who we spoke to earlier, of Highgrove, said that the late Queen Elizabeth II, in her first 5 years of her reign, 5 years after, she undertook a state visit to Paris. So there is clearly a big link between France and the United Kingdom. French president, he also released, following the Queen's death, a English statement, which is very rare, I think, for a French president to speak in English directly to the British people. talking about his sorrow and showing solidarity for the death of the Queen. Then, of course, he was across for the funeral, paying tributes to her coffin in Westminster Hall. So it wouldn't surprise me if we see him at the coronation. It's not been confirmed yet.
Oh, right, OK. I'm jumping the gun a bit on that then, OK. But we've got a statement from the Elysee Palace saying that the state visit will be rescheduled as soon as possible, so that His Majesty will be welcomed in conditions which correspond to our friendly relationship. And clearly it is a huge embarrassment to them because of not just the scenes on the streets, but we understand the French Public Services Union, CGT, said, look, we're not going to provide you with manpower to put the red carpets out, to put flags up and to get all the furnishings ready.
Yeah, I just think there was too many barriers for the French president. Buckingham Palace has said in a statement that the King and Queen Consort greatly look forward to the opportunity to visit France as soon as dates can be found. I'm sure, from my understanding, the King would be quite disappointed that he would have had to have cancelled so last minute. But as it seems that it was very much a French decision. And as you say, Mark, French embarrassment that quite so many things have led to the fact that this state visit has had to be cancelled. Security, for one. Then, of course, the union is saying they're not going to literally roll out the red carpet or prepare for the state's banquet because a majority of their workers are on strike. A few days ago, a French government spokesperson did make the point that they do have other workers who are not striking who could have put it up, but clearly it's another headache.
But clearly this was going to be a state visit. You know, there's the soft power at play here. It's not just a sort of fleeting in and out. And we understand that the visit to Germany, which was planned for later in this coming week, that will still go ahead.
Yes, it will do. You're right. The French and the British governments were hoping that this would cement the ties of our two nations. Of course, it was going to be the first time the King had gone abroad since becoming head of state of the United Kingdom. First state visit. So clearly that's a bit of a blow in terms of optics for France and Great Britain relations. So now it's going to be Germany as the first foreign trip. And again, it's that cementing of ties between the two nations and the history we have with those two nations. We can't reveal too many details as to exactly what he's up to in both Berlin and Hamburg, but clearly there's going to be all that planning is still going to be going ahead because it takes months to organise.
And we have seen, of course, the King very anxious to be seen to meet people, to go and talk to them and shake hands. Therefore, these security concerns are ever more important.
Yes, this would have been one of the concerns we've seen, haven't we, in the last few months of the King going around various parts of the United Kingdom. Even in the face of having eggs thrown at him on a couple of occasions, he has been insistent on getting out and about, greeting members of the public, shaking their hands. I was very much expecting the same thing to happen in Paris, but clearly, as you say, these protests are going on. A majority are peaceful, but clearly there is a minority which is turning it violent, and it's clearly been thought by the French authorities.
I can tell you that the latest tally,
too big of a security
903 fires across Paris itself. So I think that tells its own story. But Cameron, thank you very much indeed. And of course, we'll see what emerges in terms of dates for that visit to be reconfigured. Now, the Bank of England governor has warned businesses not to further raise their prices, or the bank may be faced to push interest rates ever higher to tackle inflation. Well, Andrew Bailey said it all risks inflation becoming embedded in the economy. Now, that official figure, of course, hit 10.4% this week, having fallen back to 10.1% the previous month. And the base rate, therefore, increased yesterday to 4.25% in response. Well, many businesses already struggling with rising costs and energy bills say they won't be able to cope with additional price pressures and the increased cost of loans, for instance. Well, let's speak now to Michael Kill, who's Chief Executive Officer of Nighttime Industries Association. Michael, thank you very much indeed for your time. What do you think of the Bank of England's, not so veiled warning to businesses?
Well, I think for us, I mean, it just shows the disconnect between the government, the Bank of England, and their understanding of what's going on at ground level. Businesses, as you suggested, are on the edge. The unexpected increase in inflation is going to impact on both consumers and business in terms of borrowing, but it definitely suggests that this crisis in terms of cost inflation is not easing, and there is no sight of the end, which is leaving many with huge concern.
I gather there's one business that's already reflected in response to Andrew Bailey that if they had actually pushed all these price increases onto the customer, pint of beer would probably cost about £20 now.
It's extortionate. I mean, even the thought process around it. I mean, we're talking about a 40% increase in operating costs. We've seen a 15% downturn in trade because of customers having less disposable income. We've done everything possible to ensure that we haven't put prices up to a point that people are not coming out, or the frequency, dwell time, or spend hasn't been impacted. So it's a very fine line. I'm slightly concerned by the comments by the Bank of England and their positioning on this. I mean, it's levied really huge concerns for the sector of why the government haven't taken the opportunity in the spring budget to actually give us some financial headroom, because I just feel at the moment that everyone is in slight disarray, and the future is so uncertain, and that presents other challenges for businesses where they're unable to plan financially for staffing or their future, and making some very critical decisions on where they're going next and how long this is going to last.
Yeah, I mean, you did get a bit of help, I think, on keg beer or, the pump prices, if you like, but clearly duty going up on other things, wine and whiskey and so on. Andrew Bailey saying, look, if everyone can hang on, they expect inflation and the pressures to really drop off quite sharply now this spring and the summer. Do you share that optimism?
I'd love to share the optimism, but we've been talking about prices coming down for some time. I mean, these prices have been going up over the course of the last year and a half, so we've suffered considerably at the moment. 7 out of 10 businesses are either barely breaking even or losing money. Some have had to make those very difficult decisions to close, which means a loss of jobs, loss of businesses within the high street. So for us, our industry has been impacted hugely. Last year, we lost 4,800 businesses. So as you can appreciate, we're slightly concerned that the projections the government are suggesting, after several other projections suggesting that we would be out of this by now, is not there. And it really, really substantiates the fact that they haven't continued the energy support also, which is a massive concern for us, given the impacts of energy costs.
Indeed. Michael, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Michael Kill, Chief Executive Officer of the Nighttime Industries Association. Now, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is in London, having met Rishi Sunak at 10 Downing Street, the meeting to strengthen bilateral ties, especially defence and intelligence, and to assess the threat from Iran. But his arrival sparked fierce protests across London. Let's get more with our national reporter Paul Hawkins, who's been following them there in Whitehall particularly. And earlier there was quite an interesting debate, shall we say, between two people you met there. Both sides expressing their either concerns at what the authoritarian approach is being taken by Netanyahu in Israel itself.
Yeah, and it's interesting you use the word authoritarian, Mark, because the way the demonstrator that was here to welcome Benjamin Netanyahu framed it was that actually, if the government want to pick judges, that's a good thing because they're elected representatives. That's the argument that he was making. So it was a fascinating exchange. And then, of course, we heard from the, for want of a better word, but I'll phrase it in this way, an anti-Benjamin Netanyahu demonstrator. She didn't want to be referred to in that sense, but she was here to demonstrate against the way that women's rights particularly have been upheld in Israel with regards to Netanyahu's administration. Of course, Benjamin Netanyahu in power for 12 years until 4 months ago when he came back to power with his Likud party, although this time controversially in coalition with parties that are considered to be ultra-religious and from the far right. And his most controversial policy, which is the main reason why a lot of demonstrators were here earlier, and indeed there have been demonstrations in Rome and Berlin where he's also been visiting because of the judicial reforms that he wants to make in terms of, firstly, giving the government more control of a committee that picks judges, and then also changing the rules so the Supreme Court would no longer be able to strike down legislation introduced by the government of the day. Hence the word authoritarian from Benjamin Netanyahu's critics, but others saying actually that's a good thing because it means elected representatives are then calling the shots more than unelected judges. Anyway, here's a flavour of what demonstrators from both sides were telling us earlier.
We find it utterly unacceptable. Israel does not have checks and balances like the US. It does not have another chamber of parliament like Britain. It is just about one parliament, a government, and the Supreme Court.
This government basically works days and nights to make sure that women will not hold any powerful positions, just raising women from public spaces. And we're very concerned about that.
The situation in Israel is that non-elected judges can make the law. It's unlike the United States, unlike UK, and all that the judicial reform wants to do is to restore the balance.
So pressure not only from the demonstrators on Rishi Sunak to confront Benjamin Netanyahu about this, but also from Alicia Kearns, the Conservative chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. She's questioned the wisdom of inviting Benjamin Netanyahu and also said we don't want to see ministers suggesting that Jordan doesn't exist or the expansion of the West Bank settlements. The ministers in question being those from Benjamin Netanyahu's government. One, in fact, his far-right finance ministers earlier making some controversial comments that there was no such thing as the Palestinian people. So Lib Dem MPs also writing to Rishi Sunak, pressure mounting on him to confront Benjamin Netanyahu, who is on a 3-day visit, so 2 more days to go in terms of his visit to the UK. In terms of the demonstrations, they've moved towards the Savoy Hotel. That is where Benjamin Netanyahu is staying, and there are likely to be more demonstrations over the weekend.
OK, we'll keep people updated on that. Paul in Whitehall, thank you very much indeed for that. But let's get the view now from Israel itself. Joining us is Amir Tibon, who's an Israeli journalist and podcaster at Haaretz. I think you're in Tel Aviv, Amir, so thank you for joining us there. What will Israel be making of this? Particularly, we understand Downing Street saying that Rishi Sunak spoke to Mr Netanyahu about, quote, the importance of upholding the democratic values that underpin our relationship.
Yeah, this has been the top headline in Israel in the last hours. Everything that is happening in London right now and that your correspondent described quite vividly. It's rare for an Israeli prime minister to come to a European or foreign capital and be met with the kind of demonstrations that Netanyahu has seen in his last visits to Rome and Berlin and now also London. And these demonstrations are not being held by people who oppose the state of Israel. The opposite is true. They are holding Israeli flags. Many of them are themselves Israeli citizens who had served in the Israeli military. And they are protesting a government that they view as a threat to Israel's democratic principles and character. And this is also the message we heard from your prime minister, who said that while this judicial overhaul that Netanyahu's government has been promoting for the last 3 months, it's an internal Israeli issue, the democratic values that form the basis of Israel's relationship with the UK and with the United States and with other Western allies, that is actually a foreign policy issue. And Israel is seen as the only democracy in the Middle East. That is one of the big reasons that so many countries in the democratic world support Israel. And if we erode our democracy at home, that is also a concern on national security and foreign policy fronts.
Yeah, because Netanyahu obviously wanted the discussions to maybe focus on the threat being posed by Iran and the whole balance, therefore, in the Middle East. But clearly, it's now changed. And just to explain to people the concern there in terms of the changes to the Supreme Court and judiciary, which I think the critics say would help protect Netanyahu from being ruled as unfit to rule. And that ties into all the various trials or allegations of conspiracies and so on.
Yes. So one of the most important issues being debated in Israel right now is the process of appointing judges. And today in Israel, there is a committee that has equal representation for politicians, the lawyers' bar, and sitting judges. It's not a perfect arrangement. There's been a lot of criticism of it. And actually, there is an argument for changing it. But the way the government under Netanyahu wants to change it is basically to give the government itself the full power to appoint justices of the Supreme Court. Now, we have to remember, Netanyahu is currently facing a criminal trial in the Jerusalem District Court. And no matter what happens there, if he's found guilty or retains his innocence, there will be an appeal to the Supreme Court. So if his government can now choose the next Supreme Court justices in Israel, he will have the power in practice to choose the justices that will be hearing his case a year or two from today. That is a huge concern to many Israelis, even people who don't necessarily oppose Netanyahu on policy grounds, but view this as a dangerous precedent and a corruption, frankly, of the judicial system. And in general, unlike the UK, where you have two houses of parliament and a longer democratic tradition. Israel is a young state. We have never written a constitution, and we are still figuring out the whole checks and balances between our authorities. And so to have the government have so much power and the judicial system so significantly weakened is a danger in the eyes of many Israelis, the ones now taking every weekend to the streets in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and elsewhere in the country.
OK, and very quickly, I mean, what sort of voice do you have in terms of the media? Is it still effectively an independent media that's able to question this?
Yes, the media in Israel overall is diverse, and there are people who report very critically of these changes and others who support it. But I think down the line, if you have a weaker judicial system, there is obviously also a threat to the free press. And some of Netanyahu's corruption charges have to do with attempts to control media outlets. So definitely down the line, this is also a danger. And other areas of our society as well. For example, the military here is under threat of disintegration because of the societal division over these changes. So a very delicate and sensitive situation. And I think it's not a coincidence that your prime minister found it necessary to criticize these changes in his conversation with Netanyahu today.
Amir, Israeli journalist and podcaster Haaretz, thank you very much for joining us there in Tel Aviv and bringing us the view from Israel. Thank you. You're watching GB News Live. Coming up, latest from Paris, of course, with the protests and, of course, that postponement now of the royal trip. What do they think there in France? That's coming up for you in a moment.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island's story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. It's just gone 1:30. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. The first state visit of King Charles to France has been postponed because of protests across the country. Tens of thousands of people have been demonstrating against the government's plan to raise the pension age from 62 to 64. The King was due to arrive on Sunday as part of a 3-day trip to Europe. Emmanuel Macron has suggested the new date for the visit will be in the early summer. The Windsor framework has now been formally adopted by both the UK and EU. The Foreign Secretary and European Commission chaired a meeting earlier to sign off the post-Brexit trade agreement. It's after MPs voted in favour of the Stormont break, despite continued opposition from the DUP. The Prime Minister has stressed the importance of upholding democratic values at a meeting with his Israeli counterpart. Benjamin Netanyahu is in London as thousands rally in Israel and here against a law that's been approved by his right-wing coalition. Critics say it's designed to shield him from his corruption trial. Rishi Sunak also called for a de-escalation in tensions in the West Bank. And Ofsted says school inspections will continue despite calls for them to be suspended. Unions representing teachers and heads want checks to be paused while a review is carried out. It's after head teacher Ruth Perry took her own life in January. She was waiting for a report which downgraded her school to the lowest possible rating. TV online, DAB+ radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News. Now it's back over to Mark.
Rhiannon, thank you very much indeed. So that first state visit by King Charles postponed amid those protests across France concerning the retirement age, state retirement age being raised from 62 to 64. In particular, the town hall in Bordeaux set on fire during the ongoing protests. 904 fires being set across Paris. Well, in the past half hour, Emmanuel Macron has been speaking in Brussels in a speech saying that the new date for the King's visit would be the early summer. The French president saying we proposed in early summer, depending on our respective agenda, we can arrange a new state visit. And that should be under conditions, he said, to allow the monarch to enjoy France. President Macron going on to say that common sense and friendship had led to the detestable decision, as he described it, to postpone the King's visit to France. I think it would not be responsible and would lack some common sense if we invited His Majesty the King and the Queen Consort for a state visit in the midst of the demonstrations. The President going on to say, out of friendship, respect and esteem for His Majesty the King and Queen Consort and for the British people, I took the initiative this morning to call and tell him what the situation was. Well, joining us now is Guillaume Bigot, who's a political commentator and journalist in Paris. Guillaume, thank you for your time. Interesting that the President actually decided to call the King himself directly.
Yes, and actually the French press and the French public has been informed this late morning that actually it was a common decision between the Élysée Palace, the President Macron, and Buckingham. And then there was a response from Buckingham making clear that it was the British part that cancelled the visit. And then probably the President Macron had to answer questions from Brussels. And he made that clear that he embodied the responsibility of the postpone of this visit. But see, at first he tried to say, well, it was a common decision. One has to say and to stress the point that for every state in the world, the first duty is to maintain order, law and order and security for its citizens, and of course, for foreign visitors and of course for foreign leaders, and especially with a close ally like Britain.
But it was only yesterday, of course, that the Interior Minister there had assured everyone that security posed no problem, that King Charles will be welcomed. So is it this incident in Bordeaux overnight, or late last night, when the town hall was attacked and burnt? Was that really the thing that decided the security detail could not cope with that?
You have to understand that there's a political issue, a main broad political issue for France, for French government, because cancelling this visit is definitely a proof of weakness and a proof that they are not in control of the situation. But moreover, it is after President Macron expressed himself and answered questions of a journalist yesterday at 1 o'clock Paris time that the situation got worse. Before that, there was certain social protest against this reform, and especially after the motion of defiance that was not passed finally at the Parliament. But it's been more than a month now that there are protests in the city, and it's been since last Friday that youngsters are gathering in the city and burning the garbage that are not collected because of the strike and the protest. But after the speech of Mr. Macron, then this became something else.
Yeah, I think 904 fires counted so far across the capital. But, of course, we also had the CGT, the union, saying they would not be providing furnishings, red carpets or flags for this. And I guess the other aspect is that the thought of them having this lavish banquet at Versailles would not be perhaps sending the right message, as it's been described, the Marie Antoinette moment.
Exactly. It seems that President Macron has a very, very... how shall I put it? He has a very he has a great intuition how to launch the anger and boost the anger of the French people. It's more or less unconscious. It's true. It was the schedule. It was scheduled a long time ago. This state visit, of course, and it's just different situations coming together for randomly. That was the word I was thinking for.
Yeah,
but as a matter of fact, it's true that it was the first thing that everybody thought about, that he has to cancel because it's a symbol. It's a very, very heavy symbol in the French history. Of course, this is where Louis XVI was with Marie Antoinette. And President Macron several times, especially during the Yellow Vest protest in 2018, he asked the protesters and the French people to say, come and get me. And of course, this is nations, exactly like individuals, as a memory, as a community. Yes. And then, of course, this something is very, very deep inside the French mentality that
let me just ask you very quickly,
any
finally,
provocation from a leader.
Yeah, finally, what does Macron do now? Because he's serving a second term. He doesn't have to worry about being re-elected. So does he actually stay with us and push it all the way through to get this reform? Because he's saying this is essential for the French economy.
Yes, that's what he wants, absolutely. But now what is at stake is the stability, is the law and order in the streets. If things are coming down, this law could eventually passed. But if the turmoil is getting worse, then he had three options. One is to ask the people through referendum to vote for or against, and the result will be against. Or he can, by himself, considering that the street is uncontrollable, retire his law. And the third issue is that we'll see what the Conseil Constitutionnel, which is the Supreme Court in France, will say about it legally. Maybe legally, that's an issue they can find inside this project and the way it was proceeded in the chamber, different types of irregularities, and that would be an option for him to back through. I don't know how to say it. To retire his
we've got it loud and clear. Thank you very much indeed for bringing us the view there in Paris.
You're very welcome.
And, of course, we'll see when that state visit is rescheduled. Thank you very much indeed. Well, talking of royal matters, it's now announced the exact spot where King Charles will have the coronation in Westminster Abbey, and you can visit too. Just make sure there's no hole in your sock. We'll explain why.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the people's channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to GB News Live. We've been updating you on that postponement of the state royal visit to France. In other royal news, it's announced that the exact spot where King Charles will be having the coronation and the anointing with oil and so on will be open to visitors, no less. But there is a catch. You'll have to take your shoes off in order to protect a 13th century medieval mosaic on the floor. Well, joining us now is Michael Cole, former royal correspondent of the BBC. And something I don't often ask you, Michael, have you checked your socks?
I will now, because I would love to see this. This is one of our greatest medieval treasures, and it's one of our best kept secrets, because I didn't know it was there. I've covered many royal weddings and other great events in Westminster Abbey, but this huge mosaic has been hidden under red velvet for 150 years. But now it has been exposed to us all and renovated and repaired in all its glory. And as you say, visitors in groups of 10 are going to be permitted to come in. And as long as they take their socks off, they're allowed to go and have a good close look at it. And what does it show? Well, it shows the globe in the center of the universe, and around the edges are depicted all sorts of fabulous beasts and wild animals, including whales, which might commend themselves to the king, who spent a long, long time, 70 years, in fact, as Prince of Wales. So it's a fantastic thing. It's called a cosmetti pavement. This family was in Italy, the Cosmetti family, and they perfected the technique of doing this sort of patio, if you will, a rather special patio. And apart from Italy, very few mosaics of this kind exist anywhere in the world.
And this is the sacrarium in the Abbey. As you say, I hadn't realised that it was actually covered, as you say, with velvet or carpet, as it's been described here, at the Queen's coronation in 1953 and George VI in 1937. So this is actually a change. And we know, of course, how much Charles likes to bring history into things.
You're absolutely right. And I'm glad you said the word sacrarium, so I didn't have to. This is the area, in fact, in front of the high altar. And the coronation chair will be placed on a small dais with shallow steps immediately over the central globe, which is the Earth, surrounded by the universe. No, nobody knew it was there. It's been covered up, and to that extent, it's been preserved. But it is an amazing thing, and quite frankly, I would love to see it. But you're absolutely right, because the coronation, of course, it's street parties, it's a great procession, it's the anointing and it's the crowning. But it is also more than that. It is the greatest and most profound moment in our constitutional monarchy, in our democracy, when effectively it's a ceremony. It's the monarch marrying the nation in public with the vows being read out. That's what it amounts to. And in Britain, unlike the Tsarist Russia or the Habsburgs in Austria or the Hohenzollerns in Prussia, there comes a moment in the ceremony when we're all asked, do we accept this king as our new monarch? And people do reply. So that is really rather democratic of us, and it goes back hundreds of years.
And as you say, that democratic process, of course, we saw everyone filing past the late Queen's coffin lying in state in Westminster Hall. We've now, as you've got saying, the chance to go over the Cosmati pavement, as it's called, one of the greatest medieval pieces of art. I think 24 feet 10 inches square in total, it says here in my notes. But we were able to walk in it ourselves, and I gather that there will be official coronation socks as well released, so people can really sort of go for the whole panoply.
Yes, you won't be able to buy that at the joke shop down the street. I think that sounds really rather good. I think Westminster Abbey is keeping up with the times, and I certainly applaud it. I would love to have a pair of coronation socks. And of course, it is big. I mean, you just described how big it is, and it's monumental. And I'm sure the King has taken great interest in this because the spirituality of the moment, the importance of its essence, is very important to him. And I'm quite sure if for one moment we can talk about the French thing, because this is a breaking news, and you're always brilliant with breaking news. I mean, this is big medicine. This is a big story today. And of course, France has always been a revolutionary country. They're always out on the streets and, or dumping their cauliflowers on the motorway to protest. And in fact, that is why Baron Haussmann built all those grand boulevards and wild avenues, so that they couldn't be blocked with a few barrels and a couple of doors, as seen in Les Miserables.
And just looking at what Macron said in this speech in Brussels about half an hour ago, calling it a detestable decision to have to postpone the King's visit, but saying that common sense and friendship had led to that decision. And of course, he had this phone call directly to the King, which is interesting in itself in terms of what it tells us about the rapprochement since Rishi Sunak's visit to the Élysée Palace.
You're absolutely right. Of course, it's a French phrase, force majeure. They've had to do it. It's a sensible decision. I don't blame them for a minute. But it is quite a blowback, not for the King, but for President Macron. He's had to bow the knee to these people. It's a great shame. I imagine the part of the visit to Berlin will still go ahead because it was a two-part thing. There was going to be Paris, Bordeaux, and then on to Berlin. I imagine that will go ahead, and that will be historic. It was the Queen had been on the throne 8 years before she made a state visit to France, and it was even longer. It was until 1965 that she visited West Germany, as it then was. That was a very important key moment of reconciliation between the two countries after two terrible world wars and all that entailed with that.
Michael, thank you very much indeed. We'll try and get your GB News socks in the post to you. Thank you very much indeed. I don't know if we've got socks. We've certainly got hats and pens, but we'll see what we can do on the sock front. Anyway, now, Ukraine preparing a counter-offensive against Russia. And this comes as we're told roughly 1,000 Russian troops have been reportedly killed in the past 24 hours. Meanwhile, Ukrainian servicemen have been heading towards Bakhmut, which has been the scene of bitter fighting. We're joining us now from Kyiv, Stefan Weichert, who's a freelance journalist based in Ukraine. And Stefan, we should add that you've obviously been to the various areas in the Donbass to see for yourself what's going on. I mean, it's been described by some as akin to First World War trench fighting.
Yeah, that's exactly how it looks like. I mean, those trenches out at the front line, it is, Russians and Ukrainians sometimes only 50 meters apart, sometimes more, just looking at each other, and it really looks like what I've seen in documentaries about First World War, what you read in the books, how the whole thing is bombed by craters, that there's only like a few naked trees left. Like, it is really a grim picture of a really brutal war.
Yeah, perhaps describe it all quiet on the eastern front, because, I mean, they've been using these Maxim machine guns that we saw in the First World War, and Ukrainian troops describing literally mowing down Russians as they come over the top.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, they're talking about that, how the Russians keep running at the position in waves, kind of like sometimes, just 40 people at a time. sometimes less. But yeah, it is kind of like trying just to overrun the Ukrainian positions and Ukrainian trying to hold their ground and shoot them down. But a lot of the Ukrainian soldiers I've spoken to said it's really, really difficult because they are lacking a lot of artillery. They're lacking a lot of ammunition, just like broadly. And that makes it really difficult for Ukraine to actually kind of stop the Russians. They have managed to do that, but they do that also at a heavy cost in terms of lives.
Yeah, I mean, do they believe that the Russians are doing this deliberately, literally sacrificing cannon fodder as such to actually use up the Ukrainian supplies of ammunition?
Yeah. The Ukrainians say that it seems like actually a strategy by the Russians. But some Ukrainian soldiers I've spoken to on my last trip to Donbass, they actually say that the Russians seem to change their strategy a little bit. So like before, they just send wave after wave in, but now they do a little bit different, a little bit smarter. For example, they send 4 or 5 soldiers running at the Ukrainian position, somebody who has no military experience. And when the Ukrainians shoot those soldiers, then the Russians know where the Ukrainian positions are. You know, they can see from where the Ukrainians are shooting, and then the more experienced the Russian soldiers attack those positions. And the Ukrainians frankly say that it's more effective than the previous, more broad, Russian strategy of just keep sending troops running to death.
Yeah, but still no breakthrough in that much vaunted spring offensive, of course. Well, Stefan, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and good to see that you're safe back in Kyiv there after reporting from the front. Thank you very much indeed. Now, football not coming home, coming to Naples. England winning 2-1 last night. It's so exciting. I'm getting it all mixed up. A defiant Italian team, of course, in Naples with their first game of the Euro qualifying campaign. And just to mark the importance of this, the first time that we've won in Italy since 1961. Well, into the second half, they held off the Italians, coming back despite going down to 10 men with just 10 minutes to go. Luke Shaw receiving those 2 yellow cards within 54 seconds of each other. The headline, though, Harry Kane becoming England's all-time record goal scorer to overtake Wayne Rooney. And, yes, scoring a penalty. Well, let's speak to Chris Scudder, who's joining us now to make up, quite a wait since 1961. And it was worth waiting for, Chris.
Yeah, it was. England had a terrible habit, Mark, of not beating the so-called big nations in major tournaments or even any competitive game. So, yeah, long time. It's the Italian job, as some of the headlines have been. You know, they got it done. They got it done in the first half. And Harry Kane, interesting, really, isn't it? I mean, he's done it so quickly. His 54th international goal, only coming in 81 games. Much quicker than Wayne Rooney, who had 53. He did in 120. And, you know, just maybe the stars are aligning now for England. You know, beating big nations is one thing. Winning tournaments is quite another. But maybe those stars are aligning, because the Euros next summer, and that win last night will have given England a springboard. They should qualify now, quite simply. They've got Ukraine, you know, football coming home tomorrow on Sunday. Yeah.
Having said that, though, Chris, a huge difference between that first and second half. And again, the wheels sort of came off a little bit in the second half, although Mancini clearly had obviously told the Italians, get your act together.
Yeah, I mean, if people are going to criticise Gareth Southgate over his, this will be his, fourth tournament in charge for England, is that his in-game management is still not great. But one thing he's got is he's got a great spirit, and we saw that in the first half. It's evolving. Let's say that. But yeah, his substitutes were a bit late, I thought, yesterday. I mean, he brought Phil Foden on, then took him off again because of the sending off. It was all a little bit muddled. So the jury's certainly out with Southgate about how he can manage in game, and if he can get that right, there's no question at all that England's squad is as good as anybody in Europe.
Okay.
And probably the world.
Yeah, and Grealish perhaps feeling a bit bruised after being taken off when he nearly scored. I mean, should he have put that in the net?
He should have done it 10 times out of 10, Mark, yeah, but that would have been 3-0 at half time. So, but, the top players do miss things. But, England, on the left, they've got Grealish, they've got Rashford, who was injured yesterday.
Yeah.
And they've got Foden, who came on. So much talent, incredible amount of... but the good thing for England was that they were good defensively in the second half yesterday.
Yes.
And teams who win tournaments have good defences. England are getting better. Harry Maguire gets all kinds of criticism. But they are getting more solid at the back. And if they can take that into the tournament next year, that's assuming they qualify, they've got Ukraine at home on Sunday, then, the sky's the limit, really, he said, tongue in cheek.
Well, indeed. And we won't ask you to audition to sing the national anthem, but clearly there might be questions about who does it at the next tournament.
It was funny, wasn't it? I was trying to work out there was a great shot of Jude Bellingham, and I think it was Carl Walker looking what's going on here. I think what happened was that the lady who was singing it, she lost her feed, so she couldn't hear the tune. And so she carried on singing, forgot the words, and everyone was looking at each other. It was a shambles, but it was quite entertaining, wasn't it?
Happens to the best of us, as they say, Chris, thank you very much indeed. Bring us your view. And, of course, we'll see what progresses with the tournament as it comes ever nearer. Thank you very much. Some of your views coming in, gbviews at gbnews.uk. First of all, on France. Ian, protests in France, a lot cheaper than nights out of the pub or disco. Protest and save yourself a bob or two. Joan, none of us should work until we're 68, especially manual workers. Why is Charles even going to France? The French are pushing illegal immigrants into our country, even though we've paid millions to them. Charles is not supposed to interfere in politics, and here he goes doing just that. Bradley, I bet there would be riots here in the UK if civil servants had to retire at 67, like in the private sector. They, of course, can retire early with good pensions paid for us by the taxpayer. And Anthony, for us who don't understand fully, can someone explain what is the difference between the Windsor framework and what we had before? ? Stay with us for the next hour. We might be trying to explain to that. Irene, meanwhile, perhaps Ofsted should do an inspection of the Met! ! Thank you for all those views. Keep them coming. And, of course, we'll bring you all the latest from France, in Paris, and also in London, where there have been protests as the Netanyahu visit. Plenty to come in this next hour. Update on the weather now.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like.
Absolutely.
On Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
It's 2 o'clock. You're with GB News Live. I'm Mark Longhurst. And coming up for you this Friday afternoon, France says no to the King, amid security fears and protests across the country becoming more violent. The King and Queen Consort have been due to visit Bordeaux as well as Paris, but last night Bordeaux's town hall was set on fire. The official visit now postponed. President Macron says he hopes to reschedule for early summer. The latest coming up from France. If you put up your prices, will increase interest rates again? The warning to business from the Bank of England's Governor Andrew Bailey. What do they think of having to swallow yet more losses in order to tackle inflation? Gwyneth Paltrow back in court, being sued by a retired eye doctor for $300,000 after allegedly crashing into him on the ski slopes. We'll have the latest from Utah. And as ever, let us know your thoughts on all those stories of the day. gbviews@gbnews.uk. And of course, we reflect those. But first, an update on all the headlines with Rhiannon.
Mark, thank you. Good afternoon. It's 1 minute past 2. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. The first state visit of King Charles to France has been postponed because of protests across the country. Tens of thousands of people have been demonstrating against the government's plan to raise the pension age from 62 to 64. The King was due to arrive on Sunday as part of a 3-day trip to Europe. The French President, Emmanuel Macron, has suggested the new date for the visit will be in the early summer. The Windsor framework has now been formally adopted by both the UK and EU. The Foreign Secretary and European Commission chaired a meeting earlier to sign off the post-Brexit trade agreement. That's after MPs voted in favour of the Stormont break, despite continued opposition from the DUP. James Cleverly told Maros Sefcovic he's grateful for his help.
This is not the corporate thanks of the British government. This is the personal thanks of me, James Cleverly, to you, Maros Sefcovic, for the commitment that you have put in, and of course the work that has been done by your wider team in getting us to what is a really good place that we are genuinely grateful.
I want to appreciate and pay respect to each and every one of you around the table, because you've been working tirelessly and in the spirit of what is possible and what we can do. While the people and businesses in Northern Ireland will now benefit from lasting certainty and predictability, the EU and UK can, and I'm convinced will, exploit the full potential of the trade and cooperation agreement.
The Prime Minister has stressed the importance of upholding democratic values at a meeting with his Israeli counterpart. Benjamin Netanyahu is in London as thousands rally in Israel and here against a law that's been approved by his right-wing coalition. Critics say it's designed to shield him from his corruption trial. Rishi Sunak also called for a de-escalation of tensions in the West Bank. Ofsted says school inspections will continue despite calls from teaching unions for them to be suspended. 3 unions say they should be paused while a review is carried out. It's after head teacher Ruth Perry took her own life in January. She was awaiting a school report. The Ofsted chief says that wouldn't be in the best interests of children. Head teacher Sophie Greenaway, though, says the mental health of staff should be a priority.
Ruth's death cannot be in vain. Ruth's death has got to lead to change. It can't just be that Ofsted say, oh, we'll have a think about the single word judgment, or that might be a good idea. That's brilliant. Yes, we would love conversations about that. That needs to happen. But that can't be the only thing. And sympathy for the family is not the only thing. They want change, and so do we.
There was a larger than expected pickup in retail sales last month, with trade returning to its pre-pandemic levels. The Office for National Statistics reported a 1.2% increase in February compared to the previous month. Experts had predicted a rise of just 0.2%. The ONS says the broader picture for retail, though, remains subdued, with little real growth over the last 18 months because of the cost of living crisis. Scientists are planning to send cancer cells to space in a bid to understand more about an incurable childhood tumour. The Institute of Cancer Research is sending samples to the International Space Station to see how it spreads in microgravity. Science Minister George Freeman says the £2.6 million project will help research brain tumour prevention in children, as well as the process of ageing. And ever fancied walking in the footsteps of the King? Well, now you can, as long as you promise to take your shoes off. For the first time in living memory, visitors will be allowed to stand in the exact spot where King Charles will be crowned inside Westminster Abbey on May the 6th. Especially guided tours will include access to the medieval mosaic, the Cosmati pavement. You'll have to wear socks, though. No bare feet will be allowed in order to protect the 13th century flooring. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens now, though. It's back over to you, Mark.
Rhiannon, thank you very much indeed. Worth waiting for because the Bank of England governor is warning businesses they've got to pull their socks up and that they should not raise prices further, or, he said, the bank may be faced to push interest rates even higher, all to tackle inflation. Now, Andrew Bailey said it risked inflation becoming embedded, as he said, in the economy. Now, the official figure, of course, hit 10.4% this week, and the base rate then increased yesterday to 4.25% in response to that. But many businesses already struggling with rising costs and energy bills say they won't be able to cope with additional price pressures or additional borrowing costs, of course, many trying to get through with loans and so on. Well, let's get the views now of Mark Bridgen, owner of the pub and restaurant The Dog at Wingham in Kent, who keeps us updated here on GB News on things on the front line. And, Mark, how do you take this warning, or is it something more sinister from the Bank of England that basically they're going to keep pushing interest rates higher if you push your prices higher?
It's just unbelievable. You know, we're not planning to put our prices up because we don't believe that our guests can take any more inflation in their lives. But we are struggling to survive, and we may have to. And the irony is that the main problem is the utility bills. You know, ours, as you've all heard from me before, have gone from £36,000 per annum to over £100,000 per annum. So the utility companies, the energy companies, have put their prices through the roof and are making record-breaking profits. And we are barely, you know, I know just in the last few weeks, I know half a dozen landlords or tenants that have just had to walk out. They've given up on their, you know, and on the whole, their family businesses. They've stopped paying themselves, and they've just been paying the utility companies. So it's incredible that we're being told, we're being warned off when everyone knows what the root of the problem is.
And I understand from one chain of businesses who have sort of calculated that if, in fact, all the price increases had been passed through, you'd all be charging 20 quid a pint. Does that ring a bell with you?
Yeah, it's, you know, we are literally holding our prices at a point where we retain some guests and I can keep my team employed, and we can pay the utility bills. You know, the general feel is that the hospitality industry is in survival mode. There's loads falling by the wayside, but those of us that can survive will get through this. Yet everything that we buy is just keeps going up. It's never ending, the price increases that we're facing, and we did our menu prices, you know, tail end of last year. And again, it's not just the energy, is it? As of next month, and I don't begrudge this, but our wage bill goes up across the board by about 10% with the increase in national minimum wage. And my team deserve it and they need it, but it's just another knock to the business that, OK, we probably need to look at putting that on the menu.
So do you believe that the policymakers, whether it's the Chancellor in terms of the government or the Bank of England governor in terms of monetary and interest rate policy, they don't understand what's going on at the sharp end with businesses?
No, I don't think they do. And so, you know what? I'll hold my prices. I might even bring them down a touch if they will decrease VAT for a period. You know, this is the measure that they did use for hospitality, and it saved, in my opinion, it saved the industry. And if they were to do that again, if they could just bring VAT back down from 20 to 10 or further if they can, then we won't have to put our prices up, and genuinely we could probably bring them back a touch, and we could all survive.
Right, that's an interesting point, and presumably you'd be thinking of that as a short-term emergency measure, because we've got Andrew Bailey basically saying, look, we expect rising costs to slow considerably, that's the phrase used, by the end of the year, and for things to get a little bit easier. So do you believe that would be a sensible option, maybe to get you to the end of this year?
Well, the price cap for industry is about to end, so our utilities are about to go up. I don't see a lot of our prices coming back down. And then the other reality is that me and many other businesses, not just in hospitality, have been strong-armed into taking 2-year contracts for utilities. So even if the utility prices come back considerably, we're tied into contracts that we can't get out of. It's so a short to mid-term solution, and my expertise is hospitality, would be to help us with the VAT, and it will give our industry a chance of surviving.
Yeah. Just looking at the other figures coming out, I mean, we've got growth figures coming through, what they call the PMI, which indicates that's up at 52.2. Just to explain, anything above 50 is good, indicating people are starting to get the economy moving. Are you finding that as a positive, that more people are coming into the pub and spending on food and drink?
So we, in year on year, we've grown our business revenue by about £100,000 net revenue, which is about 8% growth, which in the current climate is phenomenal.
Yeah.
But we've gone with all that growth, we've gone from making a small profit to making none. So, turnover for vanity and profit for sanity. I can't pay myself. I can't pay the rent to the landlord, and basically my priority is to keep my team employed and to pay the utility bills to keep the lights on. And it just doesn't stack up.
So you're running to stand still, in other words?
Yeah, which I speak to lots of people across the industry, from a local pub through to, considerable restaurant groups, hotels, and everyone is feeling the same. If we can stand still, if we can survive this period and come out the other side, grand. But the pressures that are putting us through this seem, the utility thing, we understand how and why it's happening. Do we? I don't know. Wholesale gas is apparently where it was pre the Ukraine war, and we're still all struggling with this, households and businesses. So it's 5 decades of a useless energy policy by consecutive governments. So if they can admit to that, maybe they can do something on the VAT, which is an overnight fix to enable businesses to survive and potentially thrive. I've gone from looking to grow our business, get a second site, to just putting everything on hold.
It's enough to drive you to drink, isn't it? Mark, at the Dog at Wingham in Kent, thank you very much indeed for giving us your update once more on GB News. Great to speak to you, and again, we'll catch up with you soon. Thanks very much indeed. Now, let's reflect on this state visit of King Charles to France being postponed because of the violent protests across the country. Indeed, last night in Bordeaux, where the King and Queen Consort were due to visit, the town hall was set on fire. Tens of thousands have been demonstrating against the French government's plan to raise the state pension age from 62 to 64. The King due to arrive on Sunday as part of a 3-day trip to Europe. But President Macron asking the British government to postpone the trip. Just yesterday, the French Interior Minister declaring security posed no problem. Well, let's get the latest now with our royal reporter Cameron Walker joining us in the studio, because you're updating us, Cameron, that we now know there was actually a phone call directly from the President to King Charles.
There was indeed. It seems to be a direct request from the French President to cancel or at least postpone this part of the state's visit. So a phone call took place this morning, from my understanding, between the King and French President Emmanuel Macron. From my understanding, it was agreed on all sides, from British government, Buckingham Palace and French government, that it is the right decision to postpone it due to these protests that we are seeing, and you can see on your screens now, many of which have turned violent, buildings on fire, etc. In the last hour, the French president has been speaking at a press conference And he said, I think it would not be responsible and would lack common sense if we invited His Majesty the King and the Queen Consort for a state visit in the midst of demonstrations. Clearly, there are security concerns here for the King and Queen Consort. Security experts are reported to be saying that this would have been on advice of both the French police and French security services.
Because obviously we can see the King, you know, in now his usual very relaxed demeanour, greeting people and shaking hands. That would have been unthinkable if, obviously, these protests continue, both in Paris and Bordeaux, where they were going. It would be just too much of a risk.
Yes, exactly. And we know that the King is very determined to meet as many members of the public as possible, coming across as personable, even with the threat of eggs being chucked at him, as he has had on a number of occasions in the UK. He was still defiant and went on to the next engagement, greeting members of the public. But clearly it's been thought by the French security services and police that it would not be a good idea to have the King in France during this week as protests are still continuing. It's quite embarrassing, I think, for the French government that this has happened. But also, I think, politically, President Macron would not want a situation where he is having a state banquet with red carpets and dinners and all of that.
Yeah, this is an interesting point, because, of course, even before these protests erupted in this last 24 hours, the point was being made, is this a good look to have this very lavish banquet in Versailles and of course, all the echoes of Marie Antoinette and let them eat cake and so on?
Well, that's the point, isn't it? It's kind of harking back to the French Revolution. If you've got Paris literally burning and you've got the British monarch and the Republic French president banqueting and dining on fine food, French food, in the Palace of Versailles, of course, the former French monarchy's palace. The
Sun King and so on,
Exactly, so it wouldn't have been a good look. We know from my understanding that the Berlin part of the state visit, of course, this was a two-part visit for the King and Queen Consort, is still going ahead. That's between Wednesday and Friday. They're due to also be in Hamburg during that German state
and
visit
just to explain, I mean, the significance being, these are state visits. This is not just a personal visit from the King. These are his first state visits on the international stage.
Yeah, it's a hugely significant time for him. It's his first foreign trip since he came to the throne. And clearly the thought from the two governments was that the point of the state visit was the fact that it would cement ties between the two nations, both France and Germany, in this kind of post-Brexit world, which we are together in. We've just, of course, had the Windsor framework as well.
Signed this lunchtime,
Signed this lunchtime. So I think it's going to be incredibly disappointing for the French government. But as for the King, I think he would have been perhaps disappointed that he would not be allowed to go to France. However, he's still got Germany to come. And Emmanuel Macron is saying that he suggested that the French part of this state visit should be rescheduled for early summer. Presumably that's post-coronation, because I think perhaps diaries are going to be pretty tight between now and then, and the summer seems to be a bit of a lapse.
One wonders, however, whether there will be a real effort to actually put the show back on the road, to actually indicate that they're not going to be derailed by the protests. I mean, we're just looking at the comments from Sir Peter Westmacott, former British ambassador to France, and he's reflected, I know very much that King Charles was looking forward to this visit. He's been to France 35 times officially, never mind a whole lot of private visits. He speaks French. You'll hear him when the time comes making speeches in French, which I'm sure he'll do beautifully. And, of course, this echoes the fact that, remember, the late Queen Elizabeth spoke French fluently as well. And there was the reflection on President Macron speaking English when he came to pay tribute and see the Queen lying in state in Westminster Hall.
Yes, I think it shows the history and the friendship of the two nations. The Queen undertook her first state visit to France 5 years after she came to the throne. As you said, she spoke fluent French. President Macron came across to the United Kingdom shortly after the Queen's death to pay tribute in Westminster Hall when she was lying in state, as well as to attend the funeral.
Yes.
There are rumours perhaps that he will also be invited to the coronation. That has not been confirmed by Buckingham Palace. However, clearly the fact that a state visit was happening this week, maybe we would have got some kind of announcement, as we did yesterday, from Kensington Palace's spokesperson, which confirms that the Polish president, again another strong ally of the United Kingdom, has been invited to the coronation and has accepted the invite to the coronation. So it's this kind of family of nations, I suppose, of Europe. But clearly a disappointment for the French government, very embarrassing, particularly because they had to U-turn quite so quickly.
OK.
But the King will keep calm.
While you're here, I'm going to ask you, have you checked your sock drawer?
Have I checked my socks drawer?
Because we've got this extraordinary extraordinary story now that everyone's going to be able to walk across, I think it's 24 feet by 10 inches. Henry III completed or commissioned the Kamati pavement, 1268, which is this medieval piece of wonderful art in the sacrarium in Westminster Abbey. People will literally be able to walk on it now after the official coronation is finished.
Yeah, so it's a 13th century mosaic. It's the spot where the king will be crowned with St Edward's crown in Westminster Abbey.
Anointed with oil, the whole process.
Oil.
Yeah.
It's, let's be frank, it's probably a bit of a tourist thing, but it is the first time living...
The echoes of history don't call you then,
history, no? I mean, it's the first time in a living memory that members of the public have been allowed to walk on the exact spot where the British monarch is crowned. So it is, I think it is a pretty significant moment. So it'll be interesting to know who the first person is.
Well, indeed, and what their socks, what state their socks will be in. Because I was speaking to Michael Cole a little earlier, and he was reflecting on the fact, of course, a lot of us hadn't realised that it was actually covered by velvet or carpet at the time of the Queen's coronation in 1953 and George VI's coronation in 1937. So it's not actually been seen in the open at the stage of the coronation.
No, and it hasn't been confirmed by Buckingham Palace whether it's going to be covered or not for the King's coronation.
Oh, we don't know that yet?
So we don't know. But
Interesting.
But presumably if Westminster Abbey has announced that members of the public are going to be able to walk on it, then perhaps that is some indication that they're not going to be covering it. But clearly it is a 13th century mosaic. It's going to be very delicate and they'll need to protect it. So we'll have to wait and see how many people are allowed to walk on it. But yes, you can't wear shoes to protect it and you can't have bare feet. You have to wear socks.
And suggestion there may even be some official coronation socks. I'm not sure. Anyway, we'll assess that as
a coronation tie.
Oh, right, yes.
Nice.
Well, team outfit, I think, for the day, wasn't it?
Yeah.
For the moment, thank you very much indeed. We'll let you get back and check your socks. And we're going back and checking on the situation in France in a moment, the latest on the protests, and, of course, that postponement of the royal visit. But let's take a quick break for you.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the people's channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The people's channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank. My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to GB News Live. We're just discussing with Cameron now this postponement of the official state visit by King Charles and Queen Consort to France, and indications from President Macron speaking in Brussels that they hope that the invitation for a return in early summer may be made. But let's get the view now from France, and joining us is Marie Chantrey, who's political journalist at TF1. Marie, thank you very much for your time. How is this playing out in France with the news of this postponement and indications that clearly it was all at the last minute.
Yeah, hi. Sorry for my English is not very perfect, but I try to be understandable. Yes, it's a surprise, but not really at all, because, you know, we have some rumors this last days that it was a little bit complicated, and we saw all this tension, protest, and this violence. And we asked the Élysée Palace how this visit could happen with security. And until the end, they said it was okay. But there was this communique this morning announcing the cancellation of the visit. So it's a surprise, but not really, because we were supposing that something was happening these hours.
Yeah, because the Interior Minister, of course, only yesterday assuring everyone security posed no problem, that King Charles would be welcome. So do you think it maybe what happened in Bordeaux really had to lead to a reassessment when they tried to burn down the town hall?
Of course, I think what happened in Bordeaux was a turning point in these events and this violence. So the King Charles was supposed to be in Bordeaux on, I think, on the Thursday or Tuesday, sorry. Yes. And I think the security and this image of the violence, the symbol of this violence was terrible. So I think for the president and all this minister, I think it's quite difficult decision to take, but it was necessary. And when we asking to French people in the streets, they said it was not a priority to welcome the King Charles. He's welcoming in France, but not right now.
Indeed, there was comment that perhaps the banquet in Versailles may have not been the best thing to have staged, with all the echoes of Marie Antoinette and so on.
Absolutely. This symbol would have been terrible. And, you know, the detractors and the opposition, like Jean-Luc Mélenchon, you know, would have been terrible. And that's why the Versailles castle was not really sure at the end, because they wanted to do it in the Élysée Palace for security reasons.
Yeah.
And we know that the Interior Ministry got some bad signals that there could be happen of violence around Versailles. So it was very difficult to organize. But I can tell you that everything was ready. We were at the Concorde, you know, this morning. I was with the Republican Guard yesterday. They were at all repetition. The British anthem, the God Save the King, was perfectly sing. So everything was ready. But with the situation in France.
Unlike in Naples for the football game, but we'll reflect on something else as well, and that is, of course, that I think the unions, the CGT union, said they were not providing labour to put out the red carpet and the flags and the furnishing. So clearly there were other problems going on as well.
Absolutely, I think the calendar was not really good, and I think Emmanuel Macron said at Brussels he was not serious to see the King Charles in France this week. There were a big protest this next week, and the security was here. There were like 4,000 policemen supposed to be in Paris, in Bordeaux too. But I think it's the right decision, but it's a significant loss of face for France.
Indeed.
With this decision.
Marie, thank you very much indeed, and your English spot on, so thank you very much indeed, much appreciated. Merci bien. And more, of course, coming up from Paris as we get it, but let's turn to matters here now with Ofsted saying that stopping or preventing school inspections would not be in children's best interests. All this coming after school leaders and teachers calling for a halt in the inspections. It follows the death of head teacher Ruth Perry, who took her own life in January while awaiting a report that had downgraded her school from outstanding to inadequate. Well, joining us now is maths teacher and author Bobby Seagull. Bobby, thank you very much indeed for your time. And this seems to have really resonated with many heads across the education sector coming. And we had this march, of course, yesterday in Westminster. Has this sort of been boiling up for a while?
So firstly, I want to say heartfelt response to the family and the community for Miss Perry. Obviously, it's a real tragedy to have a head teacher taking her own life. But what I want to say is that this draws attention to a larger issue about what the purpose of Ofsted is. And I actually had a chat with a couple of teacher friends a couple of days ago. And we feel as if Ofsted, while they have good intentions, they want to help improve the state of schools in our country. I don't think it does that. Again, I think it's perhaps it focuses on too wide a remit. Instead of being, in fact, Ofsted, the name itself is a bit of a misnomer. It doesn't just look at education in schools. It should focus on education in schools, but what about higher education? That's not their responsibility. There's children and social services. They've got such a huge remit. And I think as a teacher, the word Ofsted itself, even now thinking about it, I'm feeling a bit nervous. The word Ofsted itself strikes fear into teachers and education. And actually, if that's the case, it doesn't actually serve the purpose. If Ofsted is meant to increase the quality of education, it does need a reform.
But isn't the design there to actually call failing schools or failing heads to account, and therefore a little bit of fear is actually quite a healthy thing?
Again, of course, in schools, we need accountability because communities, parents need to understand how schools are performing. But I think what happens right now is very simplistic. Ultimately, schools get 4 ratings, either outstanding, good, requires improvement, or inadequate. And I think that is what causes the stress. If I were reforming Ofsted, I would think about maybe a 1 or 2 page report that looks at the areas that schools are doing well, that needs improvement, but more, I think the simplicity itself, I think that's what causes a lot of damage in schools.
So is it this one-word judgment that causes the problem, and that the Ofsted inspectors themselves don't have a wider remit to be able to actually tailor-make the report to each individual school?
Yeah, I think that's part of the issue, because sometimes some people think, parents just want a one-word summary of a school. Yeah. Of course, parents are trying to send their children to the best school possible, but we need to give them more credit. Parents can read a 1 or 2 page report and make discerning differences between schools. But yeah, I think the one-word statement, I think that is what really causes fear.
OK, well, thank you very much indeed for joining us with your view. And as you say, of course, thoughts with the family of all those involved that will assess what the situation is from Ofsted and whether, in fact, that remit will be changed. Coming up also, we'll have the latest from Utah, the latest in the Gwyneth Paltrow trial and the ski accident on the slopes there, and also reflecting on the fact that your average council tax bill now will be more than £2,000 a year. Latest news headlines now, though, with Rhiannon.
Good afternoon. It's 2:33. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. The first state visit of King Charles to France has been postponed because of protests across the country. Tens of thousands of people have been demonstrating against the government's plan to raise the pension age from 62 to 64. The King was due to arrive on Sunday as part of a 3-day trip to Europe. Emmanuel Macron has suggested the new date for the visit will be early summer. The Windsor framework has now been formally adopted by both the UK and EU. The Foreign Secretary and European Commission chaired a meeting earlier to sign off the post-Brexit trade agreement. It's after MPs voted in favour of the Stormont break, despite continued opposition from the DUP. The Prime Minister has stressed the importance of upholding democratic values at a meeting with his Israeli counterpart. Benjamin Netanyahu is in London as thousands rally in Israel and here against a law that's been approved by his right-wing coalition. Critics say it's designed to shield him from his corruption trial. Rishi Sunak also called for a de-escalation in tensions in the West Bank. And Ofsted says school inspections will continue despite calls for them to be suspended. Unions representing teachers and heads want checks to be paused while a review is carried out. It's after head teacher Ruth Perry took her own life in January. She was waiting for a report which downgraded her school to the lowest possible rating. TV online, DAB Plus radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News. Mark will be back very shortly.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know,
All
Kate
sorts
Moss?
of rooms. Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
And welcome back. You won't need reminding that the cost of living crisis is continuing, perhaps even worsening for many of you. Now, just to add a little bit of salt in the wound, the average council tax bill now will exceed £2,000 a year. And of course, yesterday, the Bank of England raising the base interest rate to 4.25%, despite the Chancellor's promise that that will be halved by the end of the year and that inflation will come down as well. Let's get the views now of Elliot Keck, Investigations Campaign Manager at the Taxpayers Alliance. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, those council tax bills just starting to come through the letterbox now. I've had mine. Ouch. Including all sorts of things for police authorities and social care, extra bits and pieces. And of course, this is not quite a stealth tax, but it's something people don't think about when they look at the budget and so on.
Well, you, like almost everybody else in this country, unfortunately, are facing council tax hikes of about 5%. So the average is 5.1%. So that's the council tax element, and then also various precepts like the mayor or the fire, the other precepts, and it means that council tax has gone up from about £1,750 for the average household before the pandemic to now well over £2,000, and for some people that's £2,500. Places like Rutland, for example. Wow. So it's very, very difficult, and it's just going to make the cost of living crisis that little bit worse for everybody.
And is it because, as many of the local authorities say, central government isn't giving them enough to actually do the job?
I mean, listen, certainly local authorities are under strain. Inflation is definitely adding to that, but there are local authorities that have taken a different path. So take Central Bedfordshire, for example, where council tax has been frozen, or Fenland, where they've actually cut council tax, or Harlow, where they've frozen council tax. So there is an alternative path, and it means cutting down on waste, it means cutting down on those top-level salaries, and it means putting a...
Right. But they're doing that for political reasons? I assume those are Conservative authorities?
I think those three are Conservative authorities, but there are also Labour councils that are also doing better things on council tax, that are increasing it by far, far less than the maximum amount. And I think, really, the thing that councils need to look at is they need to look at their spending and see if it's essential. Let's take the Mayor of London, for example. So he's announced today that he's going to spend £500,000 on a slavery memorial in London, which you may think is a good cause, but given he's just increased his element of council tax by 10%, saying that we need this money for police and fire, otherwise those services are not going to get the cash, I think it really, really rings hollow. Yeah,
let alone, of course, the controversy about ULEZ and all the additional costs on motorists. But one reflects that it's acknowledged, for instance, in terms of an extra precept to cover adult social care in terms of care homes and so on, and care for those people with dementia. That is obviously really badly needed in many areas of the country.
It is. I think certainly it's best when we're looking at these council tax measures to slightly separate the council tax element and the social care element. Social care pressures are very, very real. In order to really tackle social care, we probably need a central government solution, and while councils are having to deal with it, there is going to be pressures. But, you know, even then, there are some councils, take Sussex Council, where they're spending about £5 million on care beds that are empty. Even there are definitely things that can be done.
Right. Now, we remember the cry, no taxation without representation. We've got the local elections coming up. Will it make any difference? Or is it the fact that whatever authority comes in, they're faced with the fact that the figures don't add up?
I think, listen, there is a way to properly manage a council that allows you to freeze council tax, like Central Bedfordshire, and there's ways to bankrupt a council, like in the case of Slough, Croydon and Thurrock, where bills are going up by 10-15%. So there are very much two paths, even if no path is easy.
And who should be overseeing that, apart from bodies such as yourself that point these things up to the media?
Well, listen, many people argue that actually we should give more autonomy to local government, because if you give more autonomy to local government, then, you know, maybe you'll get more serious people involved, maybe there'll be a bigger role for local journalism, so that, you know, there are open conversations about exactly how local government should be funded and to what extent they should decide their own levels of funding.
Yeah, but, you know, having to trawl through local authority balance sheets is not going to turn most people on. So I guess we're reliant on the headlines coming out about, you know, this is going to cost you £2,000 a year.
Yeah, and listen, what I'd say to, you know, a lot of your viewers, residents in places up and down the country, it is easier than it looks. They do have to publish all of their, for example, credit card spending on their website. You can go on there, you can take a look at the spreadsheets, you can look at, you know, each individual item and think, you know, was that crate of wine really necessary? You can use freedom of information requests. There are things that the public can be doing. There are things your viewers can be doing.
And you can lodge questions at council meetings as well. Yeah,
exactly.
To make yourself a bit awkward, maybe. OK, on that note, thank you very much indeed. And, of course, we'll see what the reaction is in those local elections coming up in May. Thank you very much indeed. Well, we're talking about, of course, cost of living and those various figures. The official inflation figure, just to remind you this week, going back up from 10.1 to 10.4%. Bit of a surprise for many. And then the interest rate rise yesterday, following suit up to 4.25%. But it's causing more financial pressure, of course, for us all. But the Bank of England governor urging firms, don't increase your prices. And that may lead to yet more interest rate rises. We've already heard from a pub owner in Kent about the problems. Let's get the thoughts now of the Chief Executive of UK Hospitality, Kate Nichols, who's joining us. Kate, will you be raising a glass to the Bank of England governor?
Well, I think it is a bit of a tone-deaf comment at the moment from the Governor of the Bank of England. We have been providing information to the Bank of England over the course of the whole of the last year about the intense cost pressures that businesses are facing and the work that we have been doing to try and hold prices down as much as possible and avoid passing it through to consumers at a time of a cost of living crisis. But we are reaching a point where that is simply not sustainable, and the Bank of England needs to understand that something will have to give in these matters. The drivers of food price inflation and the drivers of inflation figures are energy prices and those high food prices that I was talking about. Those can't be absorbed by businesses like ours without substantial job losses and ultimately business failures. So passing on prices is one of the few options that smaller businesses across the sector have to be able to remain afloat. And arguably the drivers of inflation that we're seeing in the economy at the moment are not going to be helped by putting up interest rates, which will further put pressure on heavily indebted businesses.
Yeah, because, of course, many businesses have taken out loans to actually get them over the various short-term problems. But was it perhaps a rather ham-fisted way of just trying to encourage all these businesses to hang on? Because, obviously, the governor going on to say that, based on the assessments, rising costs are likely to slow considerably, he said, by the end of the year.
Well, we aren't seeing any signs of that in our sector, and we are a key driver of inflation. We have a disproportionate impact on the basket of goods. But our food price inflation bills for our small pubs, bars, restaurants have been running at about 24% over the last couple of months. That shows no sign of slowing down anytime soon. And in fact, it will get worse as you see the energy bills increasing in April as the government support falls away. So actually, if we are to keep a lid on prices, if we are to encourage businesses to be able to not pass on cost cost price increases to customers, then we do need to see better support from government for those energy bills coming through for businesses, as we have seen for domestic customers, to get us over the hump of April. Then we can start to be looking at how we can drive down prices. But at the moment, the question will be, can you keep prices low, or are you going to make staff redundant?
Yeah, and we've heard from one owner, the Dog at Wingham in Kent, pub and restaurant, that maybe one device would be to drop the rate of VAT in the short term until we actually get these pressures easing towards the year. I mean, do you share that assessment as well?
Well, we know that was the single most beneficial impact that was taken, the single biggest measure that was taken during the COVID crisis to help hospitality through. It keeps a lid on inflation. It keeps a lid on prices. It would help us to keep the cost of living as low as possible for businesses, and it would help to avoid an inflationary spike in April. Short of business support on energy, that is the next biggest thing that could be done to help customers. But we can't fight all of these battles on our own without the help of the Bank of England and the government.
So you could have had a bit more help in the budget. If you, I know, I mean, keg beers, for instance, at the bars, they had a bit of relief, I think 11 pence a pint, but that was about it.
Yeah, really what we needed, what our businesses needed to see was a shot of oxygen to get them through the intense cost price pressures that we're seeing. National living wage will go up in April, food price inflation continuing to go up, energy bills on average will go up by around 90% in April as that support slips away. Those are the areas that we needed the help. We can't avoid passing some of those cost pressures on to customers. We're doing our best to hold prices. Although our cost price inflation was running at about 20% last year, we only put up prices by around 8 to 10. So we're doing our bit, but we need some help and support. Otherwise, you are going to see business failure on the back of this.
Yeah, and of course that itself has a hit on the economy then. Kate, thank you very much. Kate Nichols, Chief Executive Officer of UK Hospitality. Thanks for joining us on GB News. Now, Gwyneth Paltrow's trial continuing, the actress being sued, to remind you, by a retired eye doctor who claims that she caused a skiing collision back in 2016. But a bit of a strange turn with a judge rejecting an offer from the actress's legal team to bring in treats to the courtroom for security officers at the trial in Utah. Let's speak now to Ellie Phillips, an entertainment reporter. Do we know what the treats were going to be, Ellie?
Unfortunately, we don't know the ins and outs of it, although, you know, she has got her own brand, Goop, so they could have been some kind of health treats from that brand, which I'm assuming would have been ideal because then that's extra brand awareness for Gwyneth. But I think it's an odd request. I don't know how they thought that it would be given the okay, especially when the opposing legal team said they had not been given any heads up about this request. They had no idea they were going to even, suggest it at all. So it was declined, and they said that they wanted to do it because they wanted to thank the bailiffs for how helpful they've been in the trial so far, and that they wanted to ask the judge and do it transparently, see if there's any objections. I think in a PR way, it's kind of nice because it's meant to be like, oh, she's so thoughtful, she's doing the right thing. But I think most people can see it a little bit more cynically than that and say, why was she really trying to do that? No one's that nice when it comes to court cases.
The judge politely declined the offer, but her legal team as well has cut up rough over the cameras in the courtroom being trained on her. And one wonders why on earth one would do that when you've got a Hollywood star that you're defending.
Well, the thing is, what they've said is her legal defence basically said that they feel that an extra camera was added specifically by PA that faces directly at Gwyneth Paltrow, and they're not happy with that. They say it's intrusive and, it's disturbing for her and actually breaches a lot of guidelines that they have in place over there. The court have actually said they're going to look into it and see what they're going to do about it, because they think actually, if it doesn't happen to everyone else that goes into that room, then why should it happen to her? And I know she's this big star and, this is a trial that's getting a lot of attention because of who she is. But at the same time, to have one camera solely focused on her face throughout is quite an intense thing to have happen, and it is something that seemed to be new specific to this case. So it looks like that camera will at some point be taken away. We'll probably find out that today because she's due back in court today and actually is due to testify today. It'll be the first time she takes a stand in this trial if it does happen today. And also in the course of the rest of this trial, we'll see her husband Brad take the stand, and also their son Moses, because they were there soon after the incident took place. So their testimonies will actually, be seen and be heard. And
Yes,
as we all know,
yeah, let's reflect. Of course, there is a serious issue about whether this gentleman actually received brain injuries as a result of the collision and who went into each other. So clearly there is legal aspects that have to be addressed by the court. But Ellie, thank you for that. We'll of course see what emerges in Utah. I think the court due to resume fairly shortly, bringing some pictures as we get them. But let's reflect now on some rather alarming statistics that 1 in 4 pregnancies end in loss. Today, Parliament is expecting to hear the second reading of what's called the Paid Miscarriage Leave Bill, because it's introduced by the SNP MP Angela Crawley to seek to grant 3 days of statutory paid leave to those parents who experience a miscarriage before 24 weeks of pregnancy. Now, currently, paid bereavement leave only provided after stillbirth following 24 weeks or 6 months into the pregnancy. Our reporter Ellie Costello has this report for us.
George Langthorne was born sleeping at 22 weeks.
George was a baby. He only weighed a pound when he was born, but he had blonde hair, big feet. Like me. He was a fully formed baby. We got to dress him and bathe him and photograph him and cuddle him. And yeah, but for anyone going through an experience of birth, it's terrifying anyway, especially the first time. But to know that you're going through a birth and that your baby's not going to survive is horrendous.
Because George was born at 24 weeks, Keely was not entitled to paid miscarriage leave. Luckily, the law firm she works for allowed her 6 weeks off to grieve. But Keely was aware that other parents were not in the same fortunate position.
The law says you go back to work at 9 o'clock the next day. So, for instance, I left George at the mortuary on a Thursday night, and the law says that I go back to work at 9 o'clock the next day. There's no way I could have done that. I just physically had a baby. Mentally, I was grieving the loss of my son. I don't know how anyone in their right mind would think that it's okay to say to someone, go back to work the next day, you'll be all right. Or take it as sick leave. But this isn't sick leave. It isn't sick leave, it isn't annual leave.
Keely is now campaigning for a change in the law, which would give a statutory 3 days of paid miscarriage leave for a loss at any time in the pregnancy. She's calling it George's Law.
We are now in 2023 where all we talk about is well-being and equality and diversity. But I don't see how any firm can say that they promote equality and diversity if they haven't got a baby loss policy in place.
1 in 4 pregnancies end in miscarriage. Under current legislation, workers are entitled to 2 weeks of paid bereavement leave following a stillbirth after 24 weeks of pregnancy. But for parents who experience a loss after less than 24 weeks, they must rely on either unpaid or sick leave if they feel unable to return to work after a loss.
Ruth Bender-Attic is the director of the Miscarriage Association.
Yes, we do support the bill, and we support it strongly, and we've been talking with Angela Crawley about it for quite some time. First of all, they'd have at least a little bit of time to begin to recover from the kind of physical and emotional impact of miscarriage or ectopic pregnancy. It would really go a long way in recognising and acknowledging even these tiniest of lives, which for most people, the minute they have a positive pregnancy test, they're already thinking and planning and dreaming about.
We asked the government to respond to this call for George's Law, but nobody was available for interview. They gave us this statement. Miscarriage is a very personal experience, and some of those affected may want to stay at home, while others may prefer to continue to work, or alternatively may need time off later. The government believes that individuals are best placed to understand their own specific needs, and good employers will respond to requests made by their employees in a sensitive way. Keely says she will still continue to fight for George's Law. Ellie Costello, GB News.
And of course, we'll keep you updated on the passage of that bill. Now, what better way to end the week but to pass judgment on Boris Johnson and the GB News People's Poll. And just to remind you, those are the figures where 48% have basically said that it was fair, 11% basically unfair in terms of this appearance at the Privileges Committee. And that's sort of 2/3 again on another survey, not believing that his defence was the right way forward. I mean, basically, the People's Poll is guilty, my lad.
Exactly. It's bad news for Boris Johnson because he was hoping to undermine this whole investigation by heavily implying getting his supporters, or at least allowing his supporters to heavily imply that it was a sort of kangaroo court, that he was being put up on trial just simply because MPs don't like him. Well, that defence hasn't gone down well with the public at all. It hasn't landed in the way that he was hoping that it would. So it now feels as though even if Boris Johnson manages to get off the 10-day suspension, which would lead to a recall...
Which is the ultimate sanction,
by-election, the ultimate sanction. Even if he manages to get off that, it feels as though his copybook is very much blotted with the public, and his chances of a return to frontline politics look pretty slim.
Yeah, and the other aspect is that the rebellion failed to really take off in terms of him saying, I'm voting against the Windsor framework, which has been actually signed, sealed and delivered today, this lunchtime.
Absolutely. So he said the night before his committee hearing, Boris Johnson, when all eyes were on him, he very publicly announced that he wouldn't vote for the Windsor framework. And he thought, and many in Westminster thought, that there would be lots of MPs who would file in behind him and choose to vote down Rishi Sunak's deal. There would be the hardcore of Brexiteers who, in previous times, have been so powerful, that those Brexiteers who voted down Theresa May's deal time after time, he thought they would be back again, supporting him, going through the no lobby. But only 22 Tory MPs ended up rejecting the bill. That's not a good look for the former Prime Minister.
As the big dog barked his last. Olivia, thank you very much indeed for all that. Thank you for being with us here on GB News Live. Patrick's next. We're back 12 noon on Monday. Stay with us here on GB News for the weather.
Hello again, it's Aidan McGivern here from the Met Office. Blustery showers for most of us during the next couple of days. Longer spells of rain at times for some. And it will turn colder through the weekend as well, with northerly winds returning. But for the time being, we've got these westerlies. Quite gusty winds affecting many southern and western areas, with winds approaching near gale force around some exposed western coasts and hills. But those winds also carrying a number of showers, and then through the evening those showers merging to longer spells of rain across southern Scotland into Northern Ireland, northern and western England and Wales. Now the showers will be fairly lively where they occur, with gusty winds and some rumbles of thunder. But away from the showers, there will be a few clear